Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku defies bad luck to achieve his goals part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. So let's start the video. All you can take with you is that which you've given. He quickly tied his shoes as he ran out the door, throwing a goodbye over his shoulder to his mom. He was late. Again, this wasn't the first time he had missed waking up to his alarm, nor did he believe it would be his last. Still, it sucked, and he really didn't want to be late for class. The glass is half full. I still have time to make it to class. Besides, now I know I'm well rested for the day. The elevator was broken, typical. It looked like he was going to be taking the stairs this morning. The glass is half full. This just means more exercise for me. He tried to keep his thoughts on a happy note. Running out the doors to his apartment complex, Izuku didn't notice a man walking in and bumped into him. He wished this wasn't such a common occurrence. It happened more often than he would like to admit. Running into things was his specialty. Not only did he end up running late every other day, he also had the misfortune to run into misplaced things such as trash cans or, more often than not, people. "Watch where you're going, kid," the man shouted ruefully as Izuku kept moving forward. He really didn't have the time to stop and apologize. Besides, that man knew who he was. He ran into that man at least twice weekly. He was known for standing outside their apartment complex and smoking. Coincidentally, Izuku was known for bumping into him on his way to class. The whole everything that could go wrong would go wrong routine was annoying and grated on his nerves. Still, there was no point in being overly dramatic about it. He knew that it couldn't be helped. He had tried for years to combat his bad luck, but to no prevail. Bad luck was just as much a part of him as breathing. It was an extension of himself, just as all quirks were to their users. Still, he tried not to let that get him down. He tried to focus on the more positive aspects of his life instead. The glass is half full, not half empty. At the very least, he was getting faster in his attempts to not be late to class. He was pretty sure he shaved off a full 2 minutes on his average mile run. He knew he would miss every stoplight. He always did, so he took the back way. It was longer, unless you were him, and would end up having to stop at every traffic light. It had taken him 3 months of being late to class before he finally figured out the system. Regardless of him knowing the system, his own sleeping hindered his ability to make it on time. The back way was his insurance route. Whenever he overslept or was running late, the back way offered him a slightly longer, but with no stoplights, way to run to school. Today would be one of those days where he used this backup route, and he hoped he was quick enough to make it to school before he was late. He thought he might make it to class on time today, but almost as soon as he reached the doors to the building, he heard the bell ring, signaling his tardiness. Just his luck. Sighing, he pushed open the doors and made his way to his class. Putting on a smile, Izuku opened the door to his class. The room hushed, as it always did. He took a deep breath, calming his nerves before stepping into class, and immediately falling flat on his face due to his shoelaces coming undone. In hindsight, he should have been more aware of this kind of thing. They happened so often he didn't even get embarrassed over it, just slightly annoyed. He ignored the hushed whispers, biting his tongue to keep quiet, of his classmates as he made his way to his desk. "Don't look at him. His bad luck will rub off on you. He's cursed. SHH. Do you want him to hear you? He'll curse you too." The whispers were quiet, but he could still hear them. It was nothing new, but they still made him wilt in on himself. How could he be anything but a villain with a quirk like that? That one stung. He knew his quirk was undesirable, but a villain's quirk. He wasn't a villain, no matter what his quirk did. He would become a hero. Izuku ducked his head lower, pretending he couldn't hear the jibes directed towards him. It was nothing new, he told himself. It didn't hurt. It did though. It hurt to be routinely called a nuisance, a curse, a bad omen. He understood why they were all hesitant to go near him. He really did. If he was being honest with himself, he wouldn't want to be near himself either. He was walking bad luck. Whenever something bad happened, he was most certainly nearby. Wherever he went, bad luck followed. His classmates picked up on that rather quickly. Once Izuku made it to his desk, he sat down and took out his notes. The glass is half full, not half empty. It wasn't all bad though. The bullying was almost non-existent, save for the hushed murmurs and rumors that spread with the fervor of a wildfire, and most of the time people just left him alone. The seclusion was nice. Sometimes it meant he could go over his future hero analysis book, though most of the time he just felt isolated. Despite his bad luck, he wanted to be a hero. He had his heart set on it, and nothing, not even his horrible luck, would deter him. Luck was a scam, a hoax. It didn't exist. At least, that's what he told himself. Otherwise, he would have to face the fact that with a quirk like his, he would never be lucky. His quirk emitted bad luck. If he relied solely on luck, he would be doomed before he even had a chance. He held the firm belief that people were who they were based on the choices they made, not the circumstances of their life. That was why he admired heroes. Despite everything bad in this world, despite the world's unfairness, they stood up for the innocent. Heroes stood against the odds, fought for a brighter future. Izuku wanted nothing more than to stand by their side, paving the way to a better future. Izuku let his attention fall on the teacher, forgetting about his own thoughts for a moment. The teacher was in the middle of their lesson when one of the overhead lights flickered, then went out. There was a collective groan. All heads turned to him. "Sorry," he mumbled. He hadn't meant to, but he must have lost control of his quirk. It happened sometimes, if he wasn't paying attention. He could have sworn he had been able to keep it from spreading, but of course, luck was never on his side. Bakugo, who was sitting in front of him, turned to him. "Way to go, nerd. You broke the light with your goddamn quirk." Bakugo had never cared about the rumors that spread about him. He didn't let that stop him from tormenting Izuku on the daily, although he did blame every inconvenience on him whenever he could. Izuku hated it. It wasn't his fault. Not purposefully, at least, that those things happened. "I said sorry," Izuku gritted out. "What more do you want?" He and Bakugo didn't get along very well, and he was probably going to pay for testing him right now. It was never good to go against Bakugo. Maybe if you could control that useless power you call a quirk, we wouldn't have to interrupt class for a fucking light outage, you fucking loser. Izuku wilted at that, turning his head to the teacher in hopes he would at least try to quell the situation, but he just gave an exasperated sigh, one meant for Izuku and not Bakugo. Even the teacher, it seemed, had tired of his eternal bad luck. Bakugo sent him one final glare before turning back in his seat. The teacher continued with their lesson, with one less light to work with, and things went back to normal. That was until the teacher started talking about heroes. Of course, everyone wanted to go into a heroics class. It was most everyone in class's aspiration to become a hero. Whilst everyone else jumped from their seats, excited to demonstrate their quirks, Izuku was less enthusiastic with his expression. He stayed quiet in his desk, putting one measly hand up. "Ah, yes, well, I'm sure you'll all make fine heroes someday." The teacher prattled on and on. He stopped paying attention until the teacher mentioned his name. It says here that Midoriya is looking at you." Izuku's head shot up at that. He couldn't believe, or well he could, actually, that the teacher had just outed him to the entire class. "Why yes," he stuttered out meekly. The murmurs commenced, not bothering to try and keep their voices down this time. He actually thinks he can be a hero. Doesn't he realize he'd probably get someone killed with a quirk like that? He's delusional. No one would want someone with his quirk as a hero. All those murmurs were drowned out by Bakugo though, as he made his displeasure known to the entire class. "What the fuck do you think you're playing at, Deku?" He growled out the cursed nickname as if it were poison on his lips. "You really think you can be a hero? That you would accept some low life with a quirk like that into their school? Your quirk's nothing but a nuisance, a fucking inconvenience to everyone." Izuku gaped at him, not knowing how to respond to that. He knew his quirk was rather unpleasant, that it never really helped anyone, but to hear it all thrown back at him like that, it hurt. I can be a hero." He said it so quietly we wasn't sure Bakugo would be able to hear him, but he did, loud and clear. Bakugo sneered at him, obviously not happy with his response. "You're just a Deku. Get your head out of the gutter. Someone like you could never, and I mean never, become a hero. With your quirk, you'd end up getting someone killed." Izuku froze. That wasn't fair. Bakugo knew that, and yet, he let his head fall, no longer willing to say anything in his own defense. Bakugo had a point. His quirk would be a nuisance to all those around him, but that didn't mean he could still be a hero, right? There was a time, in the past, where he had doubted himself, had thought he couldn't be anything. That had been years ago. He had grown from then, and knew that the future was what he made of it. That was the anthem he marched to. He had made a vow a long time ago to himself, to never give up, to never look down. He couldn't afford to be pessimistic about his circumstances, so he decided then that he would be optimistic. Life was not fair. All men were not created equal. He knew that. However, life was not fair for everyone. Everyone played by those same rules. People weren't equal, but they all had their strengths. They all had something about them that made them unique. He was unlucky. There was nothing more to it than that. He was doomed to always get the short end of the stick, to be the last picked, to lose things and trip over his feet. He learned to live with it. There wasn't anything else he could do. Now, as much as he hated it, as much as he despised this cursed quirk, he had to live with it. He had to learn to deal with it. He wanted nothing else than to be a hero, to help people and give them hope. But he doubted that was possible with this unlucky quirk of his. How could someone who always causes trouble ever help anybody? Bakugo wasn't wrong. His quirk was a nuisance. He was a nuisance. He stayed quiet. 𝗵𝘃𝐲 took that as a win and sat back down in his seat. Now that the ruckus had all but died down, the teacher continued with class. He never intervened in these situations, leaving 𝗧𝗑 to defend himself. 𝗧𝗑 remained quiet for the duration of class. Once class had ended, he silently put his future hero quirk analysis notebook back in his bag, or tried to before 𝗵𝘃𝐲 snatched it. He didn't give 𝗧𝗑 a chance to say anything before he started belittling 𝗧𝗑 for even daring to have the stupid notebook. It hurt, but mostly because 𝗵𝘃𝐲 knew what to say. He knew how to hurt 𝗧𝗑 with his words and his quirk. 𝗵𝘃𝐲 glared at him. "You won't be needing a piece of crap like this anyway." He promptly put the book in between his hands and ignited his quirk, encasing the notebook in flames that cruelly burned the pages. He swiftly walked to the window and, without looking, tossed the notebook out. Always one for theatrics. 𝗵𝘃𝐲 turned heel and gave him a menacing glare, a snarl that held some demented glee, some unknown need to hurt him, in it. 𝗧𝗑 knew that whatever he had to say wasn't going to be good. He didn't want to listen. He wanted to just walk away and ignore 𝗵𝘃𝐲, but his lackeys weren't having it. As soon as he turned to walk away, they blocked his exit, sending him a glare of their own, though it lacked the same intensity as 𝗵𝘃𝐲's. Sighing, he turned to meet 𝗵𝘃𝐲's gaze. He couldn't leave, but he also didn't care to listen to 𝗵𝘃𝐲 prattle on about something that he wouldn't allow himself to believe. "You trying to leave, Deku?" It wasn't so much a question as it was a snide remark, but 𝗧𝗑 disregarded it all the same. 𝗵𝘃𝐲 wasn't happy with his unresponsiveness to his prompts, as apparent with his heated glare burning like an ember in the night, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he whipped his head back to the window before he spoke again. "You know, Deku, I doubt this would work, because you're you." His voice was nonchalant, but there was an undertone of anger that 𝗧𝗑 didn't like. "But maybe, if you're lucky." 𝗧𝗑 hated the way he said lucky, as if it was something unattainable for him. It might work. 𝗧𝗑 scowled. He didn't trust anything 𝗵𝘃𝐲 had to say, because he knew 𝗵𝘃𝐲 rarely said anything that could be considered helpful. "Maybe if you take a swan dive off the roof, you'll get a useful quirk in your next life." 𝗵𝘃𝐲 laughed at his own words, not bothering to see his reaction to them as he turned and strode out of the room, his lackeys following suit. 𝗧𝗑 stopped. All his thoughts went blank. That wasn't. How was that? He couldn't respond to that. There wasn't a suitable response for that. He stood, staring at the window his notebook had been sent through, numb to the world. He knew his quirk was a nuisance, that it did more harm than good. Even so, he had thought, would the world be better off without him? He shook his head aggressively at the thought. No, he had promised himself he wasn't going to go down that path again. He had made a vow that he was going to change his thinking. Things were going to look better. The glass was half full, not half empty. That's what he told himself. Every time something happened, the glass was half full, not half empty. Still, his quirk only ever caused pain for himself and those around him. Could he even be a hero with something like that? Was that even a possibility? It was. It had to be. He wasn't going to allow himself to think differently. The glass is half full. Without really noticing it, he had started to leave the school. He made his way to the koi pond. Just as luck would have it, his notebook had fallen into it and was now becoming fish food. He shooed the koi fish away and grabbed the notebook. It was just a useless mass of wet paper now, but 𝗧𝗑 didn't really care. Right now, he wasn't really thinking about anything, just trying to get a grip on the situation and his own thoughts. He was walking home, he knew that, but he wasn't very aware of anything, leading to him running into multiple poles and a few trash cans, though that could have been his quirk at play too. His quirk tended to wander when he was like this, when his thoughts were waging a war and he couldn't concentrate on anything. 𝗵𝘃𝐲's statement had left him rattled. It wasn't that he actually believed 𝗵𝘃𝐲. He knew it was bluff, something said to get under his skin. And it had worked, just not for the reasons 𝗵𝘃𝐲 had intended. 𝗧𝗑 had no intention of doing something so stupid and suicidal, but the fact that 𝗵𝘃𝐲 had thought that it was okay to say something like that, regardless of intentions, was what he couldn't understand. 𝗵𝘃𝐲 wanted to be a hero, didn't he? He had always pushed 𝗧𝗑 aside so that he could have all the attention, show everyone how much better he was, but this went way past the line. Didn't 𝗵𝘃𝐲 know that? Didn't he realize that, or was he so deluded in his own thoughts that he couldn't see that what he was doing was wrong? He took a turn, leading him to a tunnel. The lighting dimmed, and he heard a rustling from behind him. He stopped and listened for another sound. Something about the air felt off, a lingering danger that stilted the tunnel. He didn't have time to react before something engulfed him in a slimy substance. It swiftly blocked off his airway and filled his lungs. He tried to break free, but it swallowed him up in a torrential wave of some blackish-green muck. Tearing at the substance did nothing to free him. His lungs were starting to burn. A vicious fire crawled up his throat as he struggled for breath. He squeezed his eyes shut. Tears found their way down his face. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His struggling was becoming less and less wild, exhaustion taking over. Is this the end? Is this how I die? on some random sidewalk on my way home from school. Mom, I'm so sorry. That's right, kid. Stop struggling. Give in. It'll be easier. The sinister, garbled voice of the slime substance, a villain, echoed throughout the tunnel. There isn't anything I can do. There's just nothing I can. No, I refuse. I can't give up. The glass is half full. Not empty, I just need to think. I can't give up. He opened his eyes, taking in his surroundings. This was a villain attack, wasn't it? It had to be. This had to be a villain, meaning there had to be some kind of weakness. He spotted an eye, a big yellow slit with red irises glaring down at him. It blinked once, his own fear-filled gaze reflected in the slitted eye. His vision started to go hazy, dimming in and out of focus as he tried to think. He could move his hand. It was free from the villain's grip. He just needed to move it up a little more. Come on, just a little further. He would have to break free from the villain's grip on his forearm to move it how he needed to. He didn't have time to falter. He struggled to free his arm. It took a lot of effort, but he was able to tear his arm out just enough. He didn't have the luxury of time on his side. He would have to strike fast if he wanted this to work. He jabbed his hand into the eye of the villain. It felt weird to punch something square in the eye, but at the moment he didn't really care about the oddness of it. It flinched, growling in protest at being poked in the eye so crudely. In its screeching, it happened to smack its head on the ceiling of the tunnel they were in, which caused it to release its grip on him momentarily. Not enough to free him, but it was enough for him to breathe at least. He took a huge breath, reveling in the fresh air before the villain regained itself. Just as the villain was about to suffocate him again, there was a change in the air pressure, and Izuku wasn't in the villain's grip anymore. Fear not, kid, for I am here. He knew that voice. He had idolized that voice for years. Its booming tone and confident inflection had always inspired hope in him. That voice belonged to All Might, the #1 hero. He watched in fascinated awe as All Might made quick work of the villain, capturing it in a 2-liter bottle. That was amazing. He was barely able to make the words come out in his awestruck state. He couldn't believe that he was seeing All Might here in the flesh and blood. It wasn't possible. Izuku was not this lucky. He had to be dreaming or hallucinating, because his luck was never this good. It was never good in general. All Might turned to him, his smile taking up most of his face, and his eyes shadowed. Only the blue irises stood out from the darkness surrounding them. I am glad you are all right, my boy. It seems I have gotten a little clumsy, as you should never have been in the crossfire. Still, I never would have caught this villain if it weren't for you, so thank you. Izuku didn't know what to say. All Might was his hero, his idol, and now he was thanking him for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't make sense. There was no reason to be thanking him. He didn't even do anything. If anything, he was just glad he had been able to survive long enough for a hero to save him. Well, it was certainly nice meeting you, kid. But I must be off. He showcased the bottle that contained the villain. I have to bring this guy in for questioning. He put the bottle in one of his pants pockets and braced, ready to run off. Izuku had a question for him though. He needed to ask this, even if the answer would break him. All Might, wait. He was running towards him now, not willing to let this opportunity to be passed up now that it was in front of him. He would never get a chance like this again. He knew that. Before he could really comprehend what he was doing, he had grabbed onto All Might just before he jumped. In hindsight, it was a ridiculously stupid thing to do. He wasn't prepared for the wind pressure, and almost let go twice before they landed on the roof of a building. The view was spectacular, a beautiful skyline of the city, but Izuku was too petrified over what he had just done to notice anything. Izuku tried to wrap his head around the fact that he had just skyrocketed to the top of a building with All Might. All Might was mumbling to himself, though Izuku couldn't make out what he was saying. He had a sneaking suspicion it had to do with him hitching a ride off of him. It took him a moment to gather himself and recall why, exactly, he had done something so incredibly stupid. That had been a terrible idea, but he needed to ask him a question. He gathered his wits and stood up straight. He just had to say it, just ask it. That's all he had to do. Steeling his nerves, he opened his mouth. Is it possible to become a hero if your quirk only hurts people? He had asked it in a jittery, discombobulated tone, stuttering over multiple words and syllables. Whatever do you mean, kid? All Might had turned to him now, gazing down at him with curiosity alight in his blue eyes. Izuku was at a loss for words. He didn't know how to explain it to his hero. My quirk. All it's ever done is hurt people and cause misfortune. It's nothing but a nuisance. He looked up expecting to see the same distrust and hesitancy he had seen in the eyes of all adults once they had learned of his quirk. Instead, he found himself face to face with a skeleton of a man. Wah, you deflated. Are you actually All Might or some kind of imposter? Had he been wrong this entire time? It seemed his bad luck knew no bounds. I am All Might. The skeleton man deadpanned, smoke dispersing around him before spitting up a blood. Izuku found several things wrong with this situation, and he had several questions, most of which consisted of asking about the health of the man. Instead of asking them, he said the first thing that came to mind. I find that rather hard to believe. Izuku was in shock. He shouldn't be. This wasn't the first time he had met an imposter. It's just that this time, he really had seemed to be the real deal. You know, kid, sometimes people put on a front. The skeleton man, who claimed to be All Might, said defensively. He sat down, lifting up his shirt to show Izuku a nasty scar that ran from his side up his chest. People are not always as they are made out to be online. See this, kid? He gestured to the scar. This is a wound I got 5 years ago, from an attack by a villain. My current appearance is because of the after effects of the multiple surgeries done to keep me alive. That looked really bad. He couldn't imagine what that fight must have been like to cause such a harrowing injury to a hero like All Might. You say you want to be a hero. Do you understand all that entails? He asked somberly. Izuku stared at him and swallowed thickly. He knew his quirk wasn't helpful, that it couldn't possibly help him in a fight. But there had to be something he could do, right? Bad luck had to be good for something. If he could learn to control it, maybe then it could be useful. The skeleton man, or rather All Might, as he insisted he was, stared at him expectantly, but he didn't have an answer. He knew what hero work entailed. He knew what he was risking, but he couldn't articulate the words at the moment. Something stopped him. You say your quirk is a quirk that only causes pain and misfortune. I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you mean by that. Care to elaborate for me? Curiosity weighed heavily in his tone. An uneasy foreboding filled the air. I don't want my kid going near him. He'll cause my kid to get hurt. Can you believe his mom lets him play with other children, knowing his quirk? I don't want someone like him near me or my kids, ever. He's just a nuisance. He'll end up a villain with a quirk like that. He wilted in on himself as the thoughts invaded his mind. The glass is half full, not empty, he reminded himself. Who would want to name a quirk like his anyway? It was more of a curse. He knew what it was, he knew what it did, but he had never given it a title. I cause bad luck to those around me. And to myself. He muttered the last part, but he knew All Might had heard him. You cause bad luck. All Might sounded shocked to say the least. That is an interesting quirk. So can I mean, is it possible to be a hero when all I do is spread misfortune? I just want to save people with a smile, like you. There was a desperate hope in his tone. He didn't like it. He hadn't meant to sound so pathetic. The glass is half full, not empty. You say your quirk only causes misfortune among yourself and others. Heroes risk their lives every day fighting villains. It's not something you can do recklessly. Any misstep could cost you your life. It's admirable that you want to help people, but caution must be exercised. So, no, I don't think it's possible for someone with a quirk like yours to be a hero. Izuku stared at him, his eyes shattering like glass as the brilliant green hue gave way to a jaded dull green. The glass wasn't half full. It was empty. Oh, he looked at the ground. I see. He knew that was the logical answer. Someone who became a burden during a fight couldn't be a hero. What he said was true and Izuku knew it, but the words still hurt. They crushed him. He didn't bother to look up into the eyes of All Might. He didn't care to see the pity that no doubt lay embedded in those blue orbs. If helping people is what you're after, there are other ways to help. Become a police officer or paramedic. Though not as praised as a hero, it is an admirable occupation. All Might was leaving now. He could hear the footsteps going to the door. It's not bad to dream, kid. Just be careful not to mix reality with wishful thinking. He was out the door. Izuku stood there, looking at the ground for a few moments. He knew that was what All Might would say. He knew his quirk couldn't help people, but even so, he wanted nothing more than to be a hero. On his way to the door he tripped. That would make 3 times today. It didn't hurt, he was used to it. His body was numb. Everything was detached, washed out, and drowning in the ever-present sea of doubt that had always followed him. Now, he had nothing to keep the doubt at bay. The metaphorical glass was no longer there. It had shattered, along with his dreams, the moment All Might declared that he couldn't be a hero. Guidelessly, he ambled down the stairs, stumbling down the last few flights. He had no destination in mind as he trudged forward, letting his feet guide him as he traversed the streets. He wasn't sure where he was going, nor did he care. Right now, he needed to be away from everything, and so he walked about aimlessly. An explosion was what finally grabbed his attention. It had come from a few blocks away. He should leave it be, let the heroes deal with it, but his feet stopped. Something tugged at him. Some unknown feeling from his chest ached at the thought of leaving, of forgetting his dreams. His walk turned into a run. He needed to go there. He didn't know why, but he had to. He didn't have control over himself. A surge of excitement and apprehension washed over him. He needed to see what was happening. His legs led him, for once without stumbling over anything, to the scene of the explosion. He stopped. His eyes went wide at the sight laid out before him. The slime villain stood, away from the crowd, with fires laden around him in a ring. He was free, not in custody, where he should have been. All Might had captured him though. He had seen it, but then why was he here? Unless, somehow he had gotten out. All Might wouldn't be so careless as to let a villain escape. However, if he were to be distracted, then it might have been possible for the villain to escape. The only time he had been distracted though had been when he was talking to He realized that All Might had been distracted by him. He had been the reason the villain escaped. He distracted All Might and let the villain escape. Once again, his bad luck has caused more harm than good. Now, the villain had escaped and began terrorizing the city again, but then, where did the fire come from? He heard a scream, some feral snarl that sounded familiar. He looked closely at the slime villain. There was someone, trapped within the monstrous villain. Red eyes like embers in the night glare at him. They were familiar, but different. Before, where they had burned brightly with arrogance, alight with a determined flame that bowed to no one, now they stared hopelessly in true terror. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 was scared. He hadn't ever seen 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 like this. For the first time, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 looked afraid. A humbleness adorned his face. It didn't belong there. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁, the person who had only mere hours ago told him to jump off the school roof, was staring at him in a fear-crazed panic. It didn't matter that 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 was Izuku's tormentor, that he shouldn't feel obligated to save him, because at that moment, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 needed to be saved. He may be a terrible person, but no part of Izuku felt that he deserved to die. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁, for however much of an asshole he made himself out to be, he was still a kid. He looked around, searching for heroes, someone to save 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 from the villain. There were none, or rather, no one had stepped up to the plate. A few looked around anxiously, obviously waiting for a more suitable hero to rush in and help, but none did. Why? Weren't they heroes? He saw their hesitance, their reluctance to move forward. He could feel the heat from the flames from where he stood. The fire raged, clawing at the sky relentlessly, black smoke leaving their fingertips and ascending into the air. These flames, Izuku realized, weren't caused by the villain. These were flames that 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 had caused in his panic-stricken state. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 had been taken captive, and nobody had tried to save him. What were these heroes playing at? This wasn't right. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 may be a prick. That was an understatement, but he didn't deserve to die. He didn't deserve to be abandoned like this. There had to be something Izuku could do. He could. The glass is half empty. He couldn't do anything. His quirk would only cause more strife. His quirk made him a nuisance. He couldn't be a hero with it. Izuku, I want you to remember this. No matter how bad things get, you have to look at the positives, okay? I know your quirk makes that hard, but you just have to stay optimistic, his mother said kindly. He had just turned 5. No one had come to his birthday party. They had been afraid something bad would happen if they did. He had been upset. He had just wanted friends, but every time he made an effort to befriend a classmate, something happened that caused them to stay away from him. He had come to learn that it wasn't just his quirk that was bad luck. He was bad luck. Optimistic, he had asked, curiosity floating in his bright green eyes. Yes, Izuku, optimistic. It means to always look on the bright side. There's this saying. She turned away from him and went to the kitchen to grab something. He waited for her to return. She does, with a glass of water. She bent down to his level and gave him the glass. Izuku, tell me something. Is this glass half full or half empty? He stared at the glass, trying to understand what she meant. It's half empty, isn't it? Because half of it is gone. He didn't know what she wanted him to say. Izuku, honey, look at me. She looked at him with a warm smile. You aren't wrong. There is only half a glass here, but the way you think about it tells a lot about you. An optimist would say the glass is half full, because it means that there is room for more. Saying the glass is half empty is like saying you can only ever take away from the glass. Do you understand? He didn't, but he had nodded anyway. It wasn't until a few years later, after the incident, that he started to understand. He couldn't view the world as he was. His quirk made everything pessimistic, so he had to be the optimism, because life wouldn't give him it. If he was going to view the glass, it had to be half full, otherwise he was giving into his quirk. He couldn't do that. There was more to life than that. There had to be. The glass was half full. There had to be something he could do. His legs had started to move him through the crowd. They weren't obeying his commands. He had to think of a plan before he was out in the open. He didn't have much time to analyze the situation. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁 didn't have that kind of time. No other heroes were going to save him. This was his chance to do something. He was almost at the edge of the crowd now. Scanning the ground, he found a few pieces of debris. He could use that. He just needed. If he ran up to it and hit its weak spot, the eye, he needed to hit the eye. How good was his aim? Could he even hit the eye if he threw something? Besides, if he tried to run, he would trip. He had to account for everything that could go wrong the moment he stepped foot past the crowd. Maybe. Could he force himself to be unlucky? Surely, he could activate his quirk, right? The debris, it wasn't more than a few meters away from the slime villain. He could feint tripping, fall into a roll. He was good at that. He's fallen enough to know how to make it not look like an accident. He had never forced his quirk to activate. When would he ever need bad luck? Though, maybe it could be helpful. If he could force himself to trip right before the villain, then he didn't have time to think anymore. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗁's struggling had lessened considerably. He was finally at the edge of the crowd, and his legs were still moving. Without any hesitance, he ran out into the fray, focusing solely on his plan. It had to work. It just had to. He concentrated on his quirk, on the manifestation of his bad luck, trying to send it out in waves. He was going to make this work. The villain noticed him. It sent out a slime in his direction. He weaved his way around it. He was light on his feet, something that would be odd for him under normal circumstances, but right now he didn't have time to dwell on it. For now, he just focused on his plan. As if on cue, he tripped. The villain's movement stopped, his didn't. He was expecting this. The villain was not. That split second of indecision by the villain, when its eyes went wide, gave Izuku his opening. His fall turned into a roll, and he grabbed for a piece of debris. It helped that there was an abundance of it everywhere. He took the bit of rubble, a sizable chunk of concrete, and hurled it at the villain. It landed square in the eye of the villain, which caused the villain to flinch and loosen his grip on 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. Izuku ran up to 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏, scrambling against the visceral sewage that covered the slime villain. The liquid-like substance was difficult to tear apart. It kept reforming, but he still tried to rip it off and free 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. "What are you doing here, idiot?" 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 shouted at him. I just couldn't leave you. My legs just started moving. And I knew I had to do something. I saw you there, calling out for help, and I couldn't do nothing." Izuku didn't really know why he had opted to save 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. All he knew was that his legs had moved on their own. The moment he has seen 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 captured by the villain, he didn't have a choice. He had to help in some way. The slime villain was regathering itself, preparing its counter-strike. Just as it was about to launch its attack, there was a change in air pressure. Out of seemingly nowhere, All Might showed up. He didn't waste any time and ended the battle with his iconic attack, Detroit Smash. His voice rang throughout the area. The clouds themselves warped and twisted in response to his punch. Rain washed down on them, drenching them in a coolness that juxtaposed the previous heat of the area. Cheers rang out from the crowd as All Might pumped his fist in the air, a declaration of his victory. The villain was hauled off by some police officers, and things were calming down. Izuku sat, zoning out as some heroes scolded him for his reckless behavior. He wanted to lash out at them, to tell them that he was doing their job for them, but he held his tongue. He knew when to keep his mouth shut. It irked him that 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 was praised for his quirk while he, the one who actually freed 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 from the villain, was berated. Though, he supposed, that was just his luck. Eventually, they let him go, telling him to not get himself caught up in any more villain fights. He walked home silently. Overall, today had been weird. He wouldn't say the day had been good by any standards, but it wasn't all bad. He still needed to apologize to All Might for causing the slime villain to escape that first time. "Hey, you good-for-nothing nerd." He jumped slightly at 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏's aggressive tone. He hadn't heard anyone walking up behind him, but then again, he hadn't really been paying attention. He turned to meet 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏, who was standing a good 10 meters away from him, at the edge of the neighborhood. The air between them was thick, tension building up with each passing second. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 didn't give him a chance to respond before he went on a tirade. "Just get this through your thick skull. I didn't ask for your dumb ass to come and save me, okay? I didn't need you to save me, you pathetic cursed nerd. I may owe you now, but don't think this changes anything. You're still a nobody." There was something odd in his voice, an emotion that Izuku couldn't discern immediately. Anger and hatred were dominant in his tone, but there were lingering traces of jealousy in his there as well. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 stormed off, not waiting to see if he had a response. Izuku didn't know what to say. He didn't regret saving 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏, even if he was an asshole with an ego the size of a mountain. He was still a person. He smiled bitterly. Even if he had saved 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏, it didn't matter. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 would always hate him, no matter what he did. Izuku was nothing more than curse in his eyes. He turned around, intent to continue on his way home and just sleep. So much had happened today. He needed to sort through his thoughts. Izuku went home, sighing as he opened the door. His mom tried to start a conversation with him, but he wasn't feeling up to it. He went to his room and collapsed on his bed. This was it. He couldn't be a hero. It didn't matter how optimistic he had been. None of that mattered if he refused to acknowledge reality. Bad luck had no business trying to be a hero. It was time he faced reality. The glass may be half full, but that didn't mean it was enough to change reality. He couldn't be a hero. Toshinori ran anxiously through the streets, filled with trepidation as he searched for that kid. He hadn't even gotten his name. He needed to talk to him. He was ashamed of himself. His actions on the roof had been diluted, misguided. They had been the words of a jaded person, not him. He should know better. He thought he was better than that. He turned the corner of one of the neighborhoods. He was sure he had seen the kid walking in this direction, but he couldn't see him anywhere. Still, he continued to search. He had to find him and right the wrongs he had done. He turned another corner, hoping he would see them, but it was empty. He knew he had seen him go off in this direction. Just as luck would have it, he must have just missed him. That kid, even with a quirk like his, one that would no doubt work against him, had run out at the villain in order to save that other boy, the one with the explosive quirk. He had seen how the heroes on the scene had berated the kid for trying to help. They were hypocrites, yelling at him for being a nuisance when they hadn't even tried to help the boy that was taken hostage by the villain. He wanted to set things right. Tell the kid that even if what he had done was reckless, it had proved that he had the heart of a true hero. His only problem was finding him. He needed to find the kid, right the wrongs he had undoubtedly done to him. That kid had the makings of a true hero, and maybe, just maybe, he could be the next holder of One for All. He continued his search, determined to find the kid and apologize. Izuku dreaded going to school the next day. He knew what awaited him, the taunts and jeers that would be thrown his way for thinking he could have been a hero. And he had tried to be a hero, had wanted to be one, even though he was. Well, him trying to be a hero had been a mistake. He couldn't be a hero. That had been made clear to him yesterday. His classmates would no doubt ask him what he had been thinking, acting like a hero yesterday. The truth was, he hadn't been thinking. All he knew was that Bakugo had been in trouble, and he had acted when no one else had, yet he still ended up being in the wrong. He was damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. He hadn't set his alarm last night, and some small part of him hoped that he would sleep in because of it. For once, though, he woke up early instead of late. Just as luck it seemed, today was going to be a long day. He could already tell. Izuku took his time getting dressed, in no particular hurry to leave the sanctuary of his room. Once he had gotten dressed, he went to grab his backpack. As he was grabbing it, a strap snagged something and everything in his backpack went flailing. He sighed, going to pick up the scattered notebooks and pencils. The glass is half full, Izuku. Try to look on the bright side of things. Being a hero isn't everything. There are plenty of other things you can be. Just think realistically. As he was putting his books back, one caught his eye. It was burned around the edges and had water damage all over it. Carefully, he grabbed it. Looking it over, he scoffed. He could make out the name he had written over the cover, Hero Analysis Book for the Future number 13. He felt a swell of anger rise up when he saw the cover. Future hero. He rolled his eyes. Yeah, right. That was just a petty dream, a fantasy I mixed up with reality. His voice was bitter, rueful regret coursing through his tone. He tossed the book aside. He wouldn't be needing it now anyway. He couldn't be a hero. Even his idol had said so. He shook his head of all his negativity. He had to stay positive. He simply couldn't let himself dwell on the negative. When he had finished collecting his things and putting them back in his backpack, he still had plenty of time until school would start. He took a deep, controlling breath. Today was going to be a good day, because now that he knew he couldn't be a hero, he could focus on the future, and whatever that entailed for him. He double-checked his room to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything, before leaving and heading for the living room. Waking up this early did have one plus side. He could finally sit down and have breakfast with his mom. He walked into the kitchen to see his mom was already up, fixing herself a cup of coffee to help ease her into the day. "Hey, Mom," he said it rather meekly. Usually he never woke up with enough time to greet her properly. She turned to him, surprise flitting through her eyes. "Oh, Izuku, you're up. And you still have time before you need to go to class," she added, glancing quickly at the clock. "Yeah," he smiled sheepishly at her. "I know. Odd, right?" She smiled warmly at him. "It may be odd, but it's certainly a nice change of pace." A genuine smile lit up Izuku's face. "Yeah, it is kind of nice, I guess." For what it was worth, no matter how bad his luck seemed to turn, he figured it had been on his side at least once, because he was pretty lucky to have his mom. Sitting down and eating breakfast, Izuku thought to himself that it was really nice to be able to sit down and relax with his mom like this. He hadn't gotten a chance to do that last night. He had been too caught up in his own head to even hold a proper conversation with her. They talked about miscellaneous things. He avoided talking about what had happened yesterday, and she had had the sense not to ask. He was sure, however, that she had seen the news and had been worried about him, but whatever fears she had seemed to dissipate once she knew he was okay. Once he had finished breakfast, he glanced at the clock. He was right on schedule with his normal routine, meaning if he left now, he could take the normal route and still be on time to class. He sighed as he got up from the kitchen table and said goodbye to his mother. He closed the door to their apartment and turned heel, to immediately trip over his laces. He really needed to buy shoes that didn't have laces. His would eternally come undone due to his quirk. He quickly fashioned his laces into a quintupled knot, hoping that would last until the end of the day. Just as yesterday, the elevator was still broken, forcing him to take the stairs. He wasn't in a rush to get to class, and because of that, he was able to watch where he was going more carefully and avoided running into anyone as he left the building. He took the long way around to school, mostly because he wanted to avoid the place for as long as he could. He wasn't in any hurry to face his peers. He was silently going over what they had done in class yesterday, trying to figure out if there was any assignments he was supposed to have done by today. So lost in thoughts, or perhaps his quirk had manifested, he didn't notice the man that was rushing through the streets. Needless to say, since both parties weren't exactly paying very much attention to their surroundings, they collided into each other. Izuku was quicker to regain himself, used to things like this happening to him. He gathered his things and apologized quickly, not giving the man time to say anything. he wasn't in the mood to be yelled at for not paying attention. Somehow, despite his best efforts to be late, he managed to get to school on time. Throughout the day, he tried to make himself scarce, not wanting to interact with any of his classmates. For the most part, they left him alone, avoided him like a plague, because, to them, he was one. A few people called him out on his attempt at heroism, much to his ire, but besides a few jibes at his person, it wasn't that bad. Everything was normal for him. The day was a typical day for him, and he had thought that maybe he would be fine. He could just forget about what had happened yesterday. Of course, luck was never on his side. "Hey, loser," one particularly nasty kid sneered. "I heard you tried to be a hero yesterday." He didn't acknowledge them. They only wanted a reaction out of him. He knew that. He didn't know anything about them besides their quirk, which was dislodging their eyes from their skull. He refused to give them what they wanted, but the kid wasn't content with his lack of response. The kid shoved him. The kid's eyes were dark and fierce as he glared at 𝗧𝗑. "I'm talking to ya." 𝗧𝗑 sighed. He had hoped to get through the day without anyone bothering him, but, of course, someone had to stop him as he was walking through the hallways. "Don't got anything to say?" The kid scoffed at his lack of response. "Yeah, I thought so. When are you going to get it through your thick skull that you will never be a hero?" He shoved 𝗧𝗑 as he walked away. Unfortunately, for everyone in the school, 𝗧𝗑 had been standing by the wall, right by the fire alarm. He didn't hit the alarm, but his bad luck seeped into the walls, and it went off anyway. When the alarm blared, 𝗧𝗑 stopped, then sighed. Great. Could this day get any worse? He knew that was a dumb question. As long as he had his quirk, then the day could always get worse. The fire alarm had caused a panic throughout the school, and thus they had ended up letting class out early. 𝗧𝗑 was okay with that. It meant he didn't have to deal with his peers or their incessant taunts and jeers. Now, he was able to collect himself. He didn't really want to go home right now. His mom would just dote and worry over him, and he didn't have to be home for quite some time yet. He decided to walk the streets. He didn't have a destination in mind, so he found himself wandering the streets aimlessly. He was avidly trying to avoid people though, as the more people he ran into the more likely it was for him to bump into or disturb them. Just because he wasn't having a great day didn't mean that he needed his bad luck to spread to them. Somehow, his feet ended up taking him towards the scene of the slime villain incident from yesterday. He scoffed as he saw some of carnage left from the villain's attack. How had he thought he could ever be a hero? He was nothing but some unlucky kid whose dreams just weren't realistic. He really should heed All Might's advice and think more realistically. He couldn't be a hero, but he could help people still. Right. There had to be something he could do. There just had to be. He was pulled from his musings by a voice calling out to him. He wasn't in the mood to interact with anyone, but it seemed as though luck wasn't on his side. He heaved a sigh, slowly stopping in his wandering to turn his attention to the person who had called for him. What he saw was the absolute last person he wanted to see right now, All Might. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had been searching the city all day, trying to find that kid. He had to find him. He had to. There were things he wanted to clear up with the kid, mainly his erroneous statement from before. How could he tell someone he barely knew that they couldn't be a hero? He had been wrong to judge a person based solely on what their quirk was. At the time, in his head, it had been a sound argument. With a quirk like that, he had certainly never heard of someone claiming to have a quirk like that before. Being a hero would be dangerous. However, he had seen the kid in action, and there had been no hesitation in his actions, only unbridled determination. It had been a long time since 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had seen something like that. Heroes nowadays were all about their presentation, about how they presented themselves to society, and how much money they could make. A real hero shouldn't care about that. Their top priority should always be to save people. He was starting to think that he would never see the kid again, never be able to make amends, to fix what he had done. It was a stroke of luck, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 concluded, when, as he was passing a street, he saw a glomp of green hair walking in the opposite direction. He wasted no time in changing direction to follow the person. He couldn't be sure that it was the same kid, but this was the closest lead he had all day. Unfortunately, he got stopped by the traffic lights. They all turned red just as he neared the crosswalks. He waited anxiously for the light to turn so he could continue his quest to find the kid. Once it did, he ran, walked to the other side. When he turned the corner, he saw the kid had stopped and was looking at the street to his right. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 followed his gaze and saw the remnants from the villain attack yesterday. Somehow, they had ended up back at that scene. He shook his head, trying to focus. He was here to talk to the kid. He really did need to find out his name. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 took up his all-might form before walking forward, confidence radiating off of him in waves. He took one step forward and crashed unceremoniously on the sidewalk. As silly as it was, when he looked to see what had caused him to slip, he saw a banana peel laid out innocently on the sidewalk. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, or rather, All Might shook in a disappointed fashion, unable to believe that someone would just leave this lying around. He moved to pick the banana peel up and throw it away in the trash. Before he could pick it up though, a voice called out to him, "You." It was shaky and sounded disbelieving. He looked up to a pair of wide green eyes. "What are you doing here? Why, isn't it obvious?" He plastered his iconic smile on his face and stood up, brushing off the non-existent dirt from his shirt. "I am here to talk to you." The kid's eyebrows furrowed. Realization flickered in his green orbs before resignation fell over his entire visage. "Oh, I see." He dipped his head down. "Look, I'm sorry I was a nuisance yesterday. It won't happen again." He had screwed up big time. This kid had the entirely wrong idea behind why he had sought him out. What made this all the worse was that he couldn't really fault the kid for thinking that, with what he had said to the kid the other day. He had to fix this. "You misunderstand." "No," the kid held up a hand. "I get it. I really do." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 winced at the pain that was embedded in his voice. "I know I should have just let the professionals handle it. Someone with a quirk like," he gestured to himself, "mine, that just is misfortune, has no business trying to be a hero." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was speechless, which didn't happen often. He was usually good with words. They came easily to him, but this time, the words just wouldn't come. He had really messed up this time. "Kid." He stopped. If he wanted to do this right, he needed to know the kid's name. "What's her name?" The kid looked at him incredulously, confusion running ragged across his face. "Midoriya Izuku." "Midoriya." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at him, his tone reflecting only the utmost seriousness. "You have the makings of a true hero." Midoriya looked at him, flabbergasted by his statement. He opened his mouth as if to respond before closing it. He repeated this action multiple times. Despair settled in his eyes. "Why?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was shocked to say the least. He expected the kid to be excited, maybe a little disbelieving, but he heard nor saw either. A resigned sorrow was implied in his tone, and his eyes were darker, jaded even. Midoriya looked away from him then. "Why would you say that? Just yesterday you said the exact opposite." When he turned back to look at him, tears had welled up in his eyes. "You can't just say something like that. It's not fair." Oh, he understood now. This kid, he was jaded. That much was obvious, but he hadn't thought about the weight his words would carry, nor had he thought about the consequences. He knew he had messed up before, but now it was painfully clear that reversing the damage wasn't something a few pretty words could fix. "Midoriya, I was wrong, back there, on the roof. I said things that I regret, and it took your actions to remind me what it truly meant to be a hero." He said it earnestly, hoping to get through to the kid. Cocking his head, Midoriya gave him an inquisitive look. "I don't." "What do you mean?" "I was told that what I did was incredibly reckless and idiotic, that I was just a hindrance for the real heroes." He spit out the words, as if disgusted by them. He then muttered, "Wasn't like they actually did anything though." "Hypocrites," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said offhandedly, before addressing Midoriya again. "While what you did was reckless and foolish, it was only because you, the least suited person in the crowd, acted when no one else would, that I was able to come in when I did. That's not." His voice shook. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 cut him off with a wave of his hand. "At that moment, I wasn't being a true hero. I expected the other heroes to help. That's not what a hero should do." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 shook his head. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He was flustered and couldn't seem to find the words. This had never happened to him before. Typically, words were something that came easy to him. Right now, though, he felt as though the words refused to come. "All Might." He was pulled from his thoughts by the tentative voice of Midoriya. "Look, appreciate you saying that, but it's not necessary." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 tensed at the resignation in Midoriya's voice. "It is necessary." He started, mouth working faster than his brain. "Many of the best heroes share one commonality from their school days. They all share one story of heroism. Their feet moved on their own. That's what happened to you yesterday, correct?" "Aye." Midoriya nodded, unable to form any words it seemed. "Midoriya," his voice was filled with confidence. "When I said that someone like you couldn't be a hero, I was wrong. You can be a hero." All Might was walking down the street towards him. Izuku didn't want to talk to him. He really didn't. He knew he had screwed up yesterday. He didn't need yet another person telling him how reckless he had been. However, as the conversation went on, it became clear that All Might hadn't come to berate him. Rather, he told him he could be a hero. Izuku was frozen by those words. Tears, that had already welled up, were falling from his face. No one had ever told him he could be anything, let alone a hero. They only ever told him what he couldn't be, but now All Might, the #1 hero, was telling him that he could be a hero. He didn't have any words. There wasn't anything he could say. He was overwhelmed. All Might had told him the words he had always wanted to hear, but never had. He was a nuisance, a curse, walking bad luck. He had no business being a hero, but then, maybe, luck had nothing to do with being a hero. All Might's intense gaze was focused on him. "You, young Midoriya, are the one who I have deemed worthy of my power." His voice was dramatic and all-encompassing. Izuku wasn't sure he had heard that right. "Worthy of his power? Don't look at me like that." It's only a suggestion right now. There wasn't any trace of jovial jokingness or deception in his voice, but still, what he had said made no sense. You couldn't just give power to someone else. Could you? I don't. He was cut off by All Might pointing at him, deflating back to his skeletal form, and spitting out blood. Whether or not you obtain my power is up to you and how much effort you give. Izuku was still confused. That didn't make any sense. All Might seemed to understand his confusion and continued, I'm talking about my quirk. My quirk is not like other quirks. You see, it is much like a sacred torch passed down from one bearer to the next. A quirk that can be passed down? Izuku inquired, still a bit hesitant to believe All Might. He had never heard of a quirk like that. Exactly. And I've picked you to be the next bearer of my quirk. Izuku wasn't buying it, but some part of him wanted to believe All Might. Quirks were unique to everyone, so it shouldn't be unheard of for a quirk to be transferred, and yet, he had never heard of one like that. All Might spread his hands out in a dramatic gesture, the power to transfer and stockpile power, one for all. 1, 4, oh, Izuku repeated. This felt like a dream, something too good to be true. Izuku was simply not this lucky. Things like this didn't happen to him. It's a power that is cultivated, then granted to the next bearer, who will then foster that power before giving it to another bearer, and so on and so forth. But why? Izuku interrupted his monologue, a question bearing down on his mind. Why give it me? Someone like me. He turned away from All Might. Surely, there's someone far more suited for a quirk like that. Midoriya. All Might began, tone tired but determined. I have been searching for a successor for a while now, and you, someone who has extraordinary bad luck, have proved to be worthy of my power. Yesterday, you were more heroic than any of those other pro-heroes were. Again, Izuku was at a loss for words. He was overwhelmed. The tears refused to halt in their assault, now falling freely from his face. Of course, All Might's tone took on nonchalance. The decision is ultimately yours to make. This can't be true. There's simply no way that this could happen. But Izuku desperately tried to wipe the tears that were falling down his face. This couldn't be real, it couldn't, and yet, the glass is half full. It was. All Might had just told him the secret behind his power, had just offered it to him, someone who emanated bad luck just as easily as he breathed, and All Might was entrusting his power to him. It was unbelievable. There just wasn't any way he could be so lucky. It has nothing to do with luck. Luck isn't the reason All Might is giving you his power. You proved yourself. Luck isn't a part of the equation. Something in the back of his mind stopped him from accepting the offer though. If All Might says I can be hero, then why do I need to accept his quirk? The power he has. It's amazing, but it's not mine. Weariness and doubt flashed across his eyes. He gave All Might a pointed look. You just said I could be a hero, but now you're saying I need your quirk. That's not what you're saying, doesn't line up with your actions. Sighing, All Might shook his head. Midoriya, it is true that I said you can be a hero, and I'm not implying that you need my quirk to do that. All I'm saying is that I have found you to be worthy of my power. Whether you choose to accept it or not is up to you. But either way, regardless on if you choose to be my successor or not, I would like to mentor you. Izuku paused. This hadn't been what he was expecting. It was one thing for the #1 hero to seek him out and tell him he could be a hero. It was another thing to have them offer their power to him. However, it was completely different to have said hero not only offer their power to him, but offer to mentor him regardless of his decision. He didn't know how to answer that. He couldn't give an answer yet. You don't have to give me an answer right now, All Might relented. I know it's a lot to take in, but please, allow me to assist you in becoming a hero. Izuku didn't really have to think about his answer this time. He could dwell on the rest later, but for now, determined green eyes gazed resolutely at Electric Blue. He still wasn't sure on if he would take All Might's quirk, but he wasn't going to let an opportunity such as this slip by. Izuku made sure to set his alarm numerous times for the following day. This was the only way to be sure he woke up when he needed to in order for him to meet All Might at the beach at 6. They had agreed to start his training today, and he really didn't want to be late. He woke up to the second alarm he had set, batting a hand at the alarm to shut it up. All he managed to do was knock it over and out of reach, making him have to physically get up to turn it off. Because he was tangled in his sheets, instead of slipping out of bed, he fell and slammed his chin on the ground. Off to a great start, he muttered sarcastically. Glass half full. You're getting up early to train with the #1 hero. That's something. Despite his initial bad luck to begin the day, Izuku couldn't help the smile that tugged at his face. He yawned as he made his way to the beach, where he and All Might had agreed to meet. The sun had yet to rise, leaving the streets dark, save for the few street lamps littered throughout the neighborhood. Under one street light, sitting in the spotlight, was a black cat. It sat, poised in a regal position, tail flickering about, a shadow in the early light. Izuku stopped in his walk and knelt down, holding his hand out for the cat. Golden eyes landed on his green ones, and the cat meowed before sitting up, ambling towards him on 3 legs. Izuku waited patiently for the black cat to make his acquaintance. Here, Shichai, he called out while clicking his tongue. He knew this cat, had even saved her a few years back when she had been hit by a car. For a black cat she sure was unlucky, though he supposed that could just be because he was nearby. Either way, he had essentially adopted the cat in a way. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had a home now, but she was an outdoor cat. He had also been the one to give her a name. She had grown somewhat attached to him, so every once in a while, when walking through the neighborhood, he would run into her. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 purred as she rubbed against 𝗧𝗑𝗧's leg. 𝗧𝗑, in turn, pet her and scratched under her chin. "Are you going to follow me to the beach then, 𝗧𝗵𝗲?" he asked, knowing he wasn't going to get a response. He stood up and started walking, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 bounding after him, only lagging slightly behind because of her missing leg. They walked in peace, the streets still quiet. The sun had barely peaked the horizon by the time he made it to the destination, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in tow. The beach before him was littered with garbage. An actual mountain of trash obscured the view of the ocean. "Good morning, young 𝗵𝗃𝗧." 𝗧𝗑 was startled by the loud and vibrant voice of All Might coming from behind him. He was in his hero form, 𝗧𝗑 noted. He offered a sheepish wave. "Good morning." He gazed around the garbage-filled beach. So, what now? He wasn't sure what the plan was as he hadn't officially accepted All Might's offer for his quirk. He had thought about it all night, but he still wasn't sure if he should take it or not. On one hand, it was a very powerful quirk that would no doubt help him become a hero. But on the other hand, it felt like cheating, like if he took it, it somehow invalidated his struggle up until this point. He had fought for so long, trying to prove that even with his quirk, he could be a hero. To take All Might's quirk, well, it felt as though that would be saying that they were right, that he couldn't become a hero with just his quirk. Now, All Might's voice brought him out of his daze. "We need to train you. It doesn't matter if you accept my offer or not. Your body needs some work." He gestured to 𝗧𝗑. "You're like a twig, and if you plan to be a hero, then you need to have some muscle mass." 𝗧𝗑 nodded dully. He should have expected this. It wasn't that he was against weight training. He had even tried to do it once before. The problem lied with his quirk. Bad luck and working with heavy weights was not a good combination. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 meowed, not happy with the lack of attention she was garnering from the two. All Might looked at the cat, then back at 𝗧𝗑. "Is that you, cat?" "No." 𝗧𝗑 shook his head. "𝗧𝗵𝗲 lives a few blocks away from me, but I was the one that saved her when she was hit by a car some 2 years ago." 𝗧𝗑 turned his head down to 𝗧𝗵𝗲, who was now rubbing up against his leg and purring. "Since then she's kinda been attached to me." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 meowed in agreeance. 𝗧𝗑 looked up to see All Might regarding him with curiosity. He gave him a questioning look. Is something wrong?" he intoned, afraid he had done something wrong. "No, nothing like that, just, I am rather curious, is all." All Might started, his voice the epitome of inquisitiveness. "Curious?" 𝗧𝗑 cocked his head to the side. "About what?" 𝗵𝗃𝗧. All Might said, a seriousness ebbing into his tone. "I don't mean to pry, but that scar," he indicated to his neck. And 𝗧𝗑 immediately knew what he was talking about. Subconsciously, he put a hand on the scar. He had forgotten how visible of a scar it was when he wore t-shirts. Usually, it was mostly covered by the collar of his uniform, but now he was wearing a regular t-shirt. The scar wasn't pretty. It was a jagged line that ran down from his behind his ear down to his chest. Memories flashed across his eyes, memories he'd rather forget. "Oh, this," he chuckled weakly, trying to brush it off, but he failed miserably. "It's nothing. Happened a long time ago." All Might looked skeptical, but didn't say anything else on the matter, much to 𝗧𝗑's delight. He didn't want to think about his scars. He had many smaller scars adorning his skin due to tripping and running into things all the time. But this scar was different. The weight this scar held dragged him down whenever he thought about it. "I see. Well, anyway, we should get started," All Might stated enthusiastically. 𝗧𝗑 looked around, taking in all the garbage that littered the beach. "So, what exactly are we doing?" "Why," his voice boomed, and 𝗧𝗵𝗲's tail puffed out at the suddenness of it. "Young 𝗵𝗃𝗧, you're going to clean up the beach." He sounded so enthused. 𝗧𝗑 just stared at him disbelievingly. And why?" He gazed upon a particularly tall pile of trash to his left. "Am I cleaning the beach?" "Exactly." All Might sighed indignantly. "Kid, people nowadays are all about flashiness, but that's not the basis of a good hero. I have always thought that true heroism has to be brought out through hard work. This beach," he indicated, "will be your first step in becoming a true hero." It was left to rot. And because of the sea currents, more and more trash has piled up. "So you're," he pointed at 𝗧𝗑, "going to clean up this beach and bring it to its former glory." All Might's confidence radiated off of him so easily, and 𝗧𝗑 wondered, briefly, if he could ever compare to someone like that. People tended to stay away from him, his quirk radiating bad vibes just as easily as All Might exuded confidence, so some part of him doubted he even could become a hero like All Might. However, another, stronger part of him, the part that refused to yield to his quirk, told him to stop dwelling on the negatives and focus on the positives. The glass is half full, just remember that. 𝗵𝗃𝗧. All Might turned his attention to 𝗧𝗑. "Which school are you applying to?" 𝗧𝗑 startled at the odd question, but answered it honestly. "I applied to 𝐒𝐬𝐽, because if there's one school I could go to, it'd have to be that one." I see. And their entrance exam is in 10 months, correct? He asked, but he sounded as though he already knew the answer. Izuku nodded. Yeah, 10 months. Well, then that leaves us with just enough time to get you in shape. Again, Izuku was mystified over how exuberant All Might could be. Even 𝗧𝗵𝗃, who had taken to sleeping inside an old worn tire, meowed in agreeance. 10 months went by much faster than Izuku had anticipated. It had been hard going, but he had been determined to prove to All Might and himself that he could do it. Of course, his bad luck did prove to be a slight problem, as he never seemed to wake up to his alarms and would trip on his morning runs. But he was able to work around that. Cleaning up the beach proved to a much more harrowing endeavor than he had initially thought. But he never gave up. Each new challenge was faced with determination and a few miscalculations, which lead to more work in the end, but Izuku really didn't mind. He was getting stronger, he could tell. He would set up at least 3 alarms every day and bought himself shoes that didn't need laces. They were still red, but took on a more boot-like quality than sneakers, so that made tripping happen less often. When he did manage to trip, it became another drill. He would have to do some kind of tactical maneuver to prevent himself from falling flat on his face. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 joined him on his morning runs almost every day, chasing after him on her 3 legs and yowling whenever he tripped. Izuku was convinced she was just laughing at him. He was exhausted all the time, but that was a price he was willing to pay. All Might had drawn up a workout plan for him, and he followed it vigorously, though, due to his bad luck, he did end up having to compensate for a few things, which ended up making him pass out a few times. As much of a pain that had been, he didn't regret any of it, because he could see the difference, day by day, that this workout was making. Today was the day of the entrance exam, and although he could tell he was much stronger than he had been 10 months ago, he still didn't feel ready. He held so many doubts about his own abilities. Not to mention, through all these 10 months, he had been contemplating over if he should take All Might up on his offer. He had finally come to a decision. He had woken up early today, having been awoken by the first alarm, and was jogging to the beach. He still had a few more pieces of junk to move in order for the beach to be clean, and he was determined to have it done before he met up with All Might at 6. He was jogging when his foot hit uneven gravel. Instinctually, he turned the fall into a roll and continued his jog, not having been slowed down in the least. He smirked at the feet. From the alleyway he heard a crash and stopped, unease filling his head before it all dissipated upon seeing 2 glowing yellow slits. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, is that you? He called out and heard a meow back. Yep, it was 𝗧𝗃. She had taken to sleeping outside, in alleyways or under parked cars, so that she would be able to follow him each morning. Ambling up to his side, 𝗧𝗃 purred and rubbed up against his leg. She was always happy to see him, even if by being by his side, she found herself in more trouble than necessary. She never seemed to mind her bad luck though, and Izuku found it funny that for being a symbol of good luck, she sure didn't have any. Come on, 𝗧𝗃, he called to her as he started jogging at a brisk pace. Today's the day, you know. 𝗧𝗃 meowed in response. She was a very talkative cat. Izuku thought absent-mindedly as he continued towards the beach. Toshinori was excited as he made his way to the beach to meet with young Midoriya one last time before the UA entrance exam. He was nervous as well. Today he would get an answer from Izuku regarding One for All, and he couldn't help but fear that Midoriya would refuse the offer. He wouldn't blame Midoriya for not wanting to take his power, given the reasons he gave, but he didn't want Midoriya to think that that was why he was offering him the power. It wasn't that he thought Midoriya couldn't be a hero with his quirk, well, not anymore at least, after having seen him in action, but he thought that Midoriya truly did have the heart of a hero. If anyone deserved the power of One for All, it was Midoriya. Him offering his power to Midoriya wasn't him saying that he thought he needed it. Rather, it was him saying that he earned this power and the right to wield it. He arrived at the beach at 6 exactly, only to see that the beach was clear of everything, with Midoriya and his unlikely pet cat standing at the beach's edge, feet tempting the ocean. He hadn't expected Midoriya to clean it completely so quickly. Young Midoriya, he called out, resuming his All Might form. Midoriya turned to look at him, exhaustion plastered on his face. All Might, I did it, he offered weakly. You did an astonishing job, my boy. He was extremely proud of how far Midoriya had come in such a short time. Now, you have truly reached your starting point in becoming a hero. Yeah, Midoriya looked at his hands in disbelief. It feels like a dream, honestly. Like I've somehow cheated. Because Toshinori held up a hand, stopping Midoriya mid-sentence. Young Midoriya, you have worked hard for your feats. Do not diminish your own hard work. Yeah, he started sheepishly. I know. There's a difference between earning something and just being lucky. He then pointed to himself, still wearing his sheepish grin, and we both know I'm rather unlucky. They both chuckled softly at that, knowing that it was true. Midoriya was definitely the most unlucky person he knew. He hadn't even known that it was possible for someone to be that unlucky, but Midoriya had once again proven his thoughts wrong. Midoriya, his voice turned serious. Now was the moment of truth. He would either have a successor for One for All or he wouldn't. Have you made a decision regarding my offer then? Midoriya looked at him then, determination resolute in his green eyes. I have. He paused for a second, before continuing. I thought it over a lot the past 10 months, and I've come to a decision. I was never one to be picked for anything. Nobody, besides my mom, had ever been on my side before. I was always told what I couldn't be, but then you told me that I could be something, that I could be a hero like I'd always wanted. His voice conveyed conviction, and Toshinori waited anxiously for his response. Then you offered me more power. And at first, I thought that it was your way of taking pity on me, because you said I could be a hero, just not with my quirk. I didn't want that. I don't need pity. That's not. Toshinori started, unable to formulate any words. He hadn't offered Midoriya one for all because of pity. I know that now. Midoriya cut in. You offered it to me because you saw something else in me, something that you thought was worthy of wielding that power, and knowing that. I accept your offer. I will be your successor. All Might. His eyes were ablaze with a fierce green fire so bright that Toshinori had no doubt he had chosen the perfect suitor for his quirk. Izuku set his gaze on the large building before him, now that he was standing before the gates of Yui. He doubted he was ready. He sure didn't feel ready. All he felt was that familiar omen of bad luck. He watched anxiously as people walked past him towards the entrance exam, but he remained standing there in awe and fear. If he passed the exam, he would end up going to the #1 school for future hero prospects. If not, he shook his head, not wanting to think about it. He didn't even know if All Might's quirk had actually transferred to him. He gagged at the memory of earlier that morning. After he had accepted All Might's power, he had expected the transfer of power to be more symbolic in nature, not eating a piece of his hair. It made sense, he guessed, but it was still disgusting. He had told 𝗧𝗵𝗃 to go home after that, not wanting her to be around all these people. Plus, he was starting to think that 𝗧𝗵𝗃's owners might be getting worried lately with how much she's been gone, out training with him. He was about to take a step forward when he heard a familiar voice call out to him. Oi, Deku, get the fuck out of my way. Or do you want to be trampled? He froze at the words, 𝗵𝘃𝗁 sparking a nervousness in him that he hated. He said nothing as 𝗵𝘃𝗁 shoved past him, sending him a glare filled with antipathy. Ever since that villain attack, 𝗵𝘃𝗁 had left him alone, but that didn't mean Izuku had forgotten what he had done that day prior to the attack. The fact that he had just acted like it hadn't even happened only made Izuku grow the slightest bit of resentment towards him. He just didn't understand why 𝗵𝘃𝗁 had done it, why he had said that. Why was 𝗵𝘃𝗁 trying to be a hero if all he did was cause pain for others? Izuku shook his head of those thoughts and took his first step forward, determined for today to be a good day. Luck had other ideas. The moment he took a step, his foot twisted, and he fell. He really should have expected this. He thought bitterly, as he naturally fell into a roll. He was so used to this by now, and had such extensive practice now that it came easy to him. Oh wow, he heard a voice call out behind him. He turned to see a girl smiling down at him in awe. I was worried you were going to fall and get hurt. I was going to use my quirk to stop you, but it looks like you had it under control the entire time. She offered up her hand to help him up. He took it wordlessly. He wasn't used to people being impressed with him, only irritated. Man, I'm nervous, she prattled on in an overtly bubbly voice. I bet you are too though. Well, good luck. She waved to him as she walked away. He watched her go. Her light brown hair bounced in step with her stride. He chuckled to himself slightly and mumbled, I doubt luck will help me out at all. She hadn't known him at all, and yet she had been so nice to him. It was probably because she hadn't known him that she was able to be nice to him. No, that wasn't fair. He shouldn't judge her like that. She had been nice to him, and even helped him up after he had tripped. With a smile on his face, he walked forward. Confidence he hadn't had before flowed through his veins. Somehow, despite his best efforts, he ended up sitting next to 𝗵𝘃𝗁. He knew it was because they were from the same school that they were seated next to each other, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Neither him nor 𝗵𝘃𝗁 seemed pleased with the seating. 𝗵𝘃𝗁 refused to stop sending smoldering scowls in his general direction. Izuku cast sidelong glances at him, annoyed at his distracting behavior. Could you knock it off? Sending me death glares won't make me leave, he seethed under his breath, trying to remain quiet. He caught a few people giving them wary glances. You shouldn't be here, 𝗵𝘃𝗁 retorted in a quiet, yet still menacing voice. They were both jolted from their conversation by the sound of Present Mike announcing his presence to them all. Izuku quickly turned his attention to the pro hero, encapsulated by the fact that he was in the presence of Present Mike, who quickly began explaining how the exam worked. Izuku tried to listen, but his own fanboy nature caught up with him, and he couldn't help but mumble out a few praises for the pro hero. He did listen to his weekly radio show after all. He had heard rumors that the teachers at Yui were pros, but he hadn't thought it to be true until now, or well, he was starting to believe it more now that Present Mike was explaining the entrance exam to them. The exam sounded pretty straightforward, from what Izuku gathered. They were to be divided into groups, hopefully. He wouldn't be with Bakugo, though, with his luck. Hoping was never helpful. Once they were divided into groups, they would be sent to the location where the rest of the exam would take place. Apparently, they were going to fight robots. Though the robots had different point values to them, there were 3 robots, with a point value of either 1, 2, or 3. So essentially, Izuku thought, the goal was to fight as many robots as possible. But then, how many people were in each group? And how many robots would there be? How even would the distribution be? He was brought out of his musings by another student standing up and addressing Present Mike. "Excuse me, sir, but I have a question," the kid asked, his voice nothing short of professional. "There are clearly 4 types of robots here on this handout we were given. Care to explain?" He took a breath before continuing. That being said, he turned to face Izuku's direction and gazed at him with intense eyes. "You curly-haired kid." The intense kid was talking to him, no doubt. "Could you please cease your mumbling? It's very distracting for us other students." Oh, he was being a nuisance again. He silently nodded and wilted in on himself. The kid nodded, then took his seat. Present Mike started to explain what the 4th robot was. Everyone had moved on from the kid's outburst by now, but the embarrassment still burned brightly in Izuku. It was just his luck, or maybe it was just his personality to have been called out like that. Just as Present Mike was about to finish his speech, he had already finished explaining how the 4th robot was worth 0 points, just something meant as a distraction or roadblock for them to avoid. His speakers cut out. Everything went silent. Izuku froze. A pro's support gear didn't just cut off. No, but he had been. And his quirk was tricky. He had caused the pro's support gear to short-circuit because he couldn't control his quirk. He clenched his fists. No one else knew about his quirk, something he was grateful for. Bakugo gave him a rueful glare, though. Because of the technical difficulties, they were let loose to go to their assigned area, which had been given to them in the handouts they had been given when they checked in. It wasn't really hard to find the areas. They were really big structures that you couldn't miss, plus they were labeled easily. And yet, he still managed to go to the wrong area twice before finding the correct one. Once he was there, he noticed that same girl from earlier was off in the corner, taking deep breaths. He wanted to wish her luck, or well, maybe not luck, but he wanted to wish her well on the exam. She had been nice to him, and he wanted her to do well in this exam. However, he was stopped by someone grabbing his shoulder. He tensed, but forced himself to relax quickly. "What are you doing?" It was that same guy from earlier, the one who had called him out. This guy really didn't give off the best first impression. He was too intense for Izuku's liking. He made a frantic hand gesture toward the girl. "I wanted to see she had. You shouldn't disturb her, or was that your plan?" His voice was still stern, and his eyes, behind the glasses, were piercing. "What? No, I wasn't. I would never," he started, flabbergasted that he was being accused of trying to cheat, in a sense, by distracting the competition. He wouldn't do that. He wanted to earn his spot at 𝐒𝐲𝐽, otherwise it would be meaningless. Around him, some people had become aware of their little squabble, taking note of his anxiousness. He could hear whispers from other students preparing for the exam, people commenting on his odd nature and befuddled appearance. Izuku could only guess what they were thinking. But if he were to go off of their expressions, he would say that they thought they were lucky to have him as competition. He thought otherwise. He knew he didn't look all that impressive, and his conversation with that guy had left him looking less than stellar, but that was hardly reason to dismiss him. Izuku thought that it was rather unfortunate for them to have to be caught up with him and his unfortunate quirk. He just shook their words off. He was used to it, and besides, he now had one for all in his grasp. He just didn't know how to use it. All Might had told him back on the beach that he wouldn't be able to use it for a few hours. That had been a few hours ago, but that hardly made a difference. The memory from this morning came to mind. "So, how exactly does this work?" Izuku had asked All Might, looking a little lost at the situation. All Might either didn't hear him, or ignored him, as he was busy plucking a hair out of his head. He held the strand out to Izuku, who looked more than confused. "Eat this." "Oh, well then, is that really necessary?" he asked while eyeing the hair suspiciously. "One for all needs to be transmitted through DNA. Only I can will it to be transferred to another person." Still eyeing it with disgust, Izuku questioned, "But does it have to be your hair?" "Well, no." All Might stood up a bit straighter. "I suppose it could be any form of my DNA, such as blood, skin, mucus, or—" "No," Izuku cut him off, not needing, nor wanting, to hear any more. "Hair is fine." He quickly took the strand of All Might's hair. He gave All Might a pointed look. "Welp, this hair must be—" He smiled deviously before finishing. "The stuff that dreams are made of." He had gagged as it went down, but forced himself to keep it in. Now, he just hoped it had worked. All Might stared at him dubiously. "Did you? Was that a—" "Yes," Izuku quickly confirmed, not giving any more insight before shrugging his shoulder. "So," he began, "will I know when it's taken effect or—" All Might gazed at him intently before smiling. "It'll take a few hours to kick in. In the meantime, you only have 2 hours until your exam." 𝗧𝗵𝗲, who had previously been watching the two in silent judgment, 𝗵𝗲 at him before getting up and stretching, lost in his reverie. He didn't notice that everyone had already started to sprint towards the entrance for the exam. He couldn't afford to be left behind. A thought crossed his mind, but he wasn't sure if he should do it. He had been practicing his control over his quirk. However, he still wasn't very good at it. The fact that he caused present mic speakers to short-circuit was proof enough that it wasn't fine-tuned enough yet. On the other hand, he would never get better if he didn't try. And there was one thing he had been practicing for this moment. He started to run, a good distance behind the rest, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He needed to pass this exam. He had a quirk, an unfortunate quirk, but one nonetheless, and he would use it as much as he could, or else, what chance would he have at being a hero? So, he focused on his quirk, letting it manifest, trying to contain it. A push and pull of some intangible force. He pulled it in, like a tide, then let it flow out. People began to trip beside him. It wasn't elegant or flashy, but it worked, and honestly, it was a little amusing to see so many people trip over their feet, some in more extravagant ways than others. He could have sworn he saw someone just keel over unceremoniously into the pavement. Someone else was waving their hands out frantically as they tried to maintain their balance, before ultimately failing and face-planting onto the ground. It was nice to be the only one not making a fool of themselves for once. He didn't make everyone trip, but it was a good enough amount for him to be able to catch up and not be left in the dirt. He felt lighter on his feet as he ran by them, easily evading the bodies as they hit the floor. In the back of his mind, he couldn't stop the phrase "let the bodies hit the floor" from coming to mind. He shook his head at his own thoughts. Now wasn't the time to be thinking of such ridiculous things. He was trying to devise a plan on how to take them down with his quirk, sans one for all, because he couldn't rely on it right now. He didn't know how it worked, or if it would even activate yet. So far, the only thing he could think of was to make them malfunction. He just didn't know if he would be able to do that with his quirk. That was a very fine-tuned attack. He could only expel his bad luck as of now. He couldn't even control what kind of bad luck it was, just that it was an inconvenience for anyone who encountered it. It seemed as though his bad luck was working against him again, as he couldn't seem to find a robot for the life of him. Everywhere he searched, he found nothing. He saw people battling robots, defeating them before he could even think of helping. There was no chance for him to even try and earn points. At this rate, he would end up with 0 points. All his hard work, it would be for naught. His own quirk would destroy his shot before he even had a chance. No, the glass is half full. There was still time. He just needed to find a robot. That was all. He would do this. He would pass. He entered a clearing and saw 3 people, and 4, no longer functioning, robots. It seemed as though no one else was having the same trouble as him in finding the enemy robots to attack. He heard an announcer say they had 4 minutes left, leaving him to panic over the fact that he had 0 points. Just then, another robot, a 3-pointer, entered the clearing. This was his chance, he knew it, but there were other people here. He couldn't afford to let them take away his shot. He had to stop them from attacking. He had to. One of the kids, that same one who told him off twice, started to run. It appeared as though he had engines in his legs. Izuku couldn't let him get to the robot though. This one was his. He focused, trying to pinpoint his quirk on the kid. He took a deep breath and expelled the intangible nature of his quirk. He could feel some form of energy leaving him. He had never tried to pinpoint his quirk before. He had speculated over it when he had been trying to analyze his quirk, but never had he put it into focus. He gazed at the kid, wondering if it would work. He could almost see it, his bad luck chasing the kid as he ran, but figured that it was just his eyes tricking him. Then, Izuku noticed the kid's engine legs started to fume. Just as he was about to run up and decimate the robot, his legs flared, and he overshot his kick. Izuku couldn't believe it. He had been point blank, and he still missed. His quirk must have worked. He was getting tired, mentally. Never before had he exerted his quirk this much before on purpose. However, he was determined to power through this. He wasn't the only one tired. And besides, he needed to get this robot. He had to prove that he could do this, that he was worthy of being a hero. It happened quicker than before. He could feel the power leaving him, as though it were a wave crashing through the surf. It felt strange, but he decided not to dwell on it right now. Instead, he focused on the manifestation of his quirk, trying to make it strong enough for it to go against the robot. The robot took a step forward. A girl that had been in the clearing ran up to attack it. Izuku tried to focus his quirk with more urgency. Just as the girl was about to attack, her arm had turned into a spear of some sort. The robot stopped. Smoke and steam rose from within the metal beast. Its eyes blinked rapidly, flashing red and white sporadically. The robot fell to the floor, having malfunctioned from the inside. Izuku smirked, then let out a breath. He felt good right now, full of adrenaline. The feeling didn't last long as he realized that it had been one robot, and he only had about 2 minutes left until the exam ended. He wasted no time staying in the area, rushing past the girl, who still had an astonished expression on her face, and the other kid, the one with engines in his leg. The one other kid that had been in the clearing had run away sometime after the guy with engines for legs had missed his attack. Speaking of, he didn't see that guy anywhere. He must have run off to find another robot to attack while Izuku had been attacking. It didn't matter, he surmised. All that he cared about was finding more robots and gaining more points. Though, he thought full of chagrin, he didn't have much time left. Clearing his head, he ran through the streets of the arena. He turned a corner and saw more people and less robots. He was about to keep running when a monstrously large robot broke through the buildings and loomed over them. It's the 0-pointer. There's no point attacking it, just run. Izuku turned heel, but his eyes caught sight of a girl on the ground unmoving. It was that same girl from earlier, the one who had been kind to him. She was stuck, some debris had struck her, and she couldn't move. He needed to get away from the 0-pointer. There wasn't enough time to delay, but then he couldn't leave her. Izuku froze. He couldn't leave her. She was trapped, maybe injured. And even if his instincts told him to run, he couldn't leave her. He couldn't take out that big of a robot with his quirk though. Could he? Or, well, there was another option. He did have another quirk in his arsenal. You don't know how to use that though, or if it even works. I don't really have any other choice though. It's too dangerous. Why risk it? Determination burned in his eyes, fire flowing through his steadfast stance, and his mind set firm on his decision. Because there's someone who needs help. Is there any other reason I need? The glass is half full. I have to trust All Might's power, my power. Besides, my safety isn't a question here. He glanced quickly at the girl. She was still struggling to move, while everyone else ran away. His decision was made. He focused, this time on one for all, on the manifestation of power. He needed to get up high, if he wanted to land a decent punch on it. Given that he wasn't sure how much control he would have over this quirk, he needed to hit it head on, point blank. That meant he needed to get up close to it, and up on its level. Well, it was now or never, he thought. He let the energy rush through him, electricity running rivulets throughout him. He could feel the fire in his veins, a burning sensation that bubbled and cracked to life. Golden red tendrils spread across his legs as he prepared to jump. When his feet left the ground, it was like an explosion, fireworks going up his legs as he soared through the air. Adrenaline kept him from feeling the pain that had to be going through his legs right now. They felt a little too numb for there to be nothing wrong. He didn't have time to worry, though, as he fired up the quirk once more, this time in his right arm. He bared his arm, ready to give his all in his attack. He knew that with this attack he was throwing away any chance he had passing this exam, but saving that person was more important. Well, Mr. Robot, say hello to my little friend. He smirked as his fist made contact with the metal beast. The initial impact hadn't been as exciting as he thought it would be, nothing like All Might's attacks. However, after a moment of pause, the impact reverberated throughout the robot's body, causing it to internally combust and implode on itself. Then he was falling. Oh, he did not think this through. His arm hurt really, really badly. He glanced at it to find it broken, bruised and lacerated, and useless. Of course, I get a cool, actually useful quirk, but it just happens to break me when I use it. Fitting, really, if I think about it. No, glass half full. At least the quirk worked, and I saved that girl right. That's all that matters. Izuku tried not to panic as he neared the ground. He really did try, but as the ground approached it was becoming increasingly difficult. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for impact. A sharp pain spread through his face. That was not what he expected. Hesitantly, he opened his eyes to see the ground. A good foot in front of him still. He hadn't made contact yet. He was held, suspended in the air. He heard panting, and turned his gaze to see that girl. The same one he had met at the entrance of the school, the same one he had just saved. Panting with a relieved expression on her face, before she put her hands together, and he fell, this time actually landing on the ground. Gee, thanks. He managed to breathe out, gasping out in pain as his injuries came back to him. The girl wasn't paying attention to him though. Instead, she was puking off to the side. He wondered if she really was okay. He realized with painful, in both his body and mind, clarity that he wasn't going to be able to get any more points in this exam. He had screwed it up. This had been his chance, and he messed it up. He heard the announcer say the exam was over, and he thought his life may as well be over as well. Think positive, damn it. The glass is half full. You saved that girl. Don't have a pity party just because you probably failed the exam to the one school you wanted to go to. He wasn't doing a great job cheering himself up, but he, in part, blamed that on his aching body. Now that the adrenaline had worn off, he really fucking hurt. It crossed his mind that it was very idiotic of him to use a quirk he'd barely had for 2 hours in the heat of battle. One for all coupled with his bad luck quirk could only spell disaster, namely, bad luck unto himself. With that thought in mind, he promptly passed out. The following week was nothing short of overtly mundane and inane for Izuku. After he had passed out at the exam, the school nurse, recovery girl, had healed him. It had left him exhausted, but well enough to go home that evening. He had been under strict instructions to not overexert himself, but it wasn't as though he had plans to use his quirk and break his bones more. No, if anything, he was regretting even using it in the first place. It had really only caused him more trouble than good. Over the course of the week, he was in autopilot. He did his daily routine, but everything felt moot. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had even taken notice as she was extra chatty to make sure he never forgot about her presence. He didn't. It was rather hard to when she would rub up against his leg every other minute and yowl until he petted her or gave her a treat. It was a wonder she was still so thin, given how many treats he gave her. He enjoyed the company though. His morning runs, which he didn't count as too exertive, and thus he still did them, were awfully quiet when she wasn't present. Beside that though, everything else kind of blended together until it was suddenly 9 at night. And he was still working as if it was only 5. He knew the letter from Yui, telling him whether he passed or not. He was sorely leaning towards the not side, was due in a week. He couldn't help but hope for and dread its arrival every day. It was Saturday, and 𝗧𝗂 had slept in until 10. He cursed when he woke up, finding out it was already so late in the morning. Even if it was Saturday, he liked to go for his morning runs early in the morning. Still, since he didn't have anything else to do today, he took his time getting ready, which was probably the only reason he didn't get super frustrated. He couldn't find his shirt. Then he slammed into his desk, which was then followed by him tripping over a stray pair of pants that were lying around and ending up on the floor. He sighed. Well, at least he was fully awake now. After a bit of a struggle, he managed to get dressed and had a quick, light breakfast before heading out for his usual run. As he left his building, after running into several people and spilling someone's coffee, he was immediately attacked by the small force that was 𝗧𝗵𝗲. He was knocked off balance by the sheer force of her hurtling herself at him. For a small cat, she sure packed a punch. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 rode at him, her voice sounding on the border of worried and annoyed. It was more annoyed than worried though. "I guess you missed me this morning," he quipped as she rubbed up against his shoulder, meowing the entire time. "I'll take that as a yes," he said as he got up, dusting himself off and preparing to start his not-so-morning jog. "Sorry I was late, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. I overslept." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 just meowed in reply, though it sounded more like an exasperated sigh. 𝗧𝗂 had never felt more judged, at least not by a cat like this. He just shook his head and started on his jog, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 running in tandem with him. All was going well. For once 𝗧𝗂 wasn't running into trash cans or poles. He had a really bad habit of doing that, or well, at least really bad luck. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 easily kept up with him, which was impressive considering she only had 3 legs and was usually as unlucky as him in her attempts to run. For a black cat, which was meant to be a symbol of luck, she was really unlucky. 𝗧𝗂 thought it had to do with the fact that she was around him so much, but he never dwelled on it. His luck, of course, ran out when he turned a corner and ran into Deku. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 immediately went on guard. She wasn't a big fan of Deku at all. He didn't blame her. "Watch where you're going, nerd." Deku sounded about as enthusiastic as 𝗧𝗂 felt to see him. "Oh, Deku," he gritted out as he regained his footing. "Sorry," he mumbled as he took a step forward, determined to just leave Deku alone and have as little interaction with him as possible. He wasn't afraid of Deku. He wouldn't be afraid of him anymore. He wasn't the same kid who was shunned by everyone and taunted by his peers. He had a reason to fight now, a goal that he believed in. He was going to be a hero. And that meant he couldn't afford to let petty disputes hurt him any longer. Deku, however, had different plans as he grabbed 𝗧𝗂's shoulder as he tried to pass him. "What the hell do you think you're playing at, taking Yui's entrance exam?" His voice was threatening, a low growl. "You can't be a hero." 𝗧𝗂 stopped by his side. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 hissed, a low growl settling deep within her chest. He knew his quirk wasn't suited to help people. He knew that, but he had made it work anyway. He had done something good during the exam, regardless of the fact that he wouldn't get any points for it. He had saved that girl. Sure, he hadn't actually used his own quirk, but it still counted. He gritted his teeth. "You can't stop me," he bit out. Deku scoffed. "You actually think Yui will let someone like you into their school?" His laughter was bitter. "You're even more delusional than I thought." Turning to glare at him, 𝗧𝗂 scoffed himself. "That may be so, but what makes you think they would want you?" He let his gaze bore into Deku, who had startled at his declaration. "I mean, sure, I may be unlucky." His voice was tauntingly dangerous. "But at least I don't consciously hurt people. If you ask me, that's pretty unheroic." He shrugged his shoulder out of Deku's grasp, motioning quickly for 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to follow before turning one last time to Deku. "You know, Deku, you may have a strong quirk, but there's more to being a hero than just strength." He left it at that, not finishing his thought. Deku didn't say anything, and he didn't follow him. He just remained standing there at the corner, an unbelieving and frustrated expression on his face. Once 𝗧𝗂 was out of sight, he shuddered. He couldn't believe he had just said that, and wasn't killed. He had wanted to say that, and so much more to Deku for so long. But he had always been so afraid of the consequences. Now, though, he was glad he had said it. Bakugo needed to know that he wasn't all that he thought he was. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 pulled him from his musings as she pawed at him, sending a pathetic look at him with her honeydew eyes. "Are you hungry?" he asked. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 only ever gave him the big eyes when she wanted wet food. She gave a happy meow. Izuku, once again, thought that she was one of the most talkative cats he had ever met. They turned back and headed home. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 rarely ever came home with him. She usually went back to her own house, but sometimes she wandered home with him, and because of this, he started to buy cans of wet food for her. She really liked wet food. He only tripped up the stairs thrice on his way to his apartment, something that he considered a win. When he entered his home, he called out, "Mom, I'm home," and 𝗧𝗧𝗏 followed me again. He took his shoes off and headed to the kitchen. "I'm just gonna give her some wet food, okay?" His mom never had a problem with 𝗧𝗧𝗏. She actually loved the cat, and 𝗧𝗧𝗏 was always extra affectionate towards her. "Oh, Izuku." He heard his mom call from some other room, as he grabbed a can of the wet food for 𝗧𝗧𝗏 and put some in a bowl for her. His mom came into the kitchen, trembling as she held up an envelope. While you were gone, the mail came." She looked as nervous as he felt in that moment. This was it. He paled and snatched the envelope, staring at it intently. All right, I'll be in my room then." He robotically left the kitchen and went to his room. Once he was there, he continued to stare at the envelope, too petrified to open it. In this envelope held his future. Eventually, he did tear at the envelope. A device fell from the confines of the envelope, which, given a few seconds displayed, watched it with trepidation. All Might popped onto the screen. Izuku watched in wonder and fear as All Might explained that he was going to be working at 𝐒𝐬𝐽. "You did well on the written test, though. Your score on the practical was less than desirable." He knew it was a pitiful attempt, but still he had thought that maybe. He balled his fists in his lap. It was stupid to have hoped. However, immediately following the exam, this young lady came to us directly and vouched for you. The screen cut off to show the same girl he had saved by defeating the 0-pointer. She looked worried as she spoke with the examiners. "Excuse me." "Hi," she started out nervously. "Sorry to bother you, but I was just wondering. You know that boy? He had curly hair and freckles. Actually, he was kind of plain looking." She started to ramble out. "Plain looking? Well, I guess that's not an insult. Would it be possible to share some of my points with him? He got injured, saving me from that robot, and it caused him to lose out on some points." She looked around nervously before gaining control of herself. "Please, at least give him the points he missed out on because of me. That boy, he saved my life." Izuku couldn't believe what he was hearing. He didn't even know this person, and yet they were trying to help him. "I'm sorry, miss, you can't share points, but don't worry," the voice of Present Mike said reassuringly. All Might cut back in, "For you see, young Midoriya, there was more to the exam than just smashing robots." That made sense. If Izuku thought about it, there wouldn't be enough robots for everyone to get a sufficient score. There simply had to be more for them to go off of. "Midoriya Izuku." All Might's voice boomed. "With 3 attack points and 67 rescue points, you pass." Izuku stopped. He actually passed. 67 rescue points. But all he did was take out that one 0-pointer. How did that add up? Could he have gotten a few rescue points for that one 3-pointer? There were other people there, so he might have been able to gain a few points from that, but still. A composite score of 70 left him in 4th place. 4th place, it was crazy that he had managed that. Even if he was incredibly happy with his placement, he couldn't help but doubt his deserving of it. This would make him a target, no doubt, being so high up in the ranks. He shook his head. It didn't matter where he ranked. He had passed, and that's all that mattered. He was so happy, he didn't even realize that the tears had started to form. He was going to 𝐒𝐬𝐽. He was going to be a hero. Wiping his eyes, he got up to go tell his mom the news. Izuku made his way down to the beach where he had agreed to meet All Might. He was excited as he walked the last block to the beach. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 had already gone home, and the night felt lonely without her presence, but Izuku was too elated to let that get him down. He was going to 𝐒𝐬𝐽. He had been accepted. He had proved that he was enough. He wondered, fleetingly, if Bakugo had been accepted, but decided it didn't matter. He didn't care. As he approached the beach, he saw the form of All Might, in his deflated form, waiting for him. He ran up to greet him. Just as he was about to stop, his feet caught on something, or maybe it was just his quirk at play, and he tripped, landing face first into the sand. He brushed it off, or rather, tried to. "So, you wanted to talk about something?" Offering a hand for him. All Might helped him up. "Congratulations on passing, kid." His congratulations would have been a lot more effective if he hadn't started spitting up blood halfway through. But Izuku was still beyond elated to have the praise of his hero. "Thanks, I was really worried that I screwed everything up. With my quirk and all." He scratched the back of his neck sheepishly. "Why would you think your quirk screwed everything up?" All Might asked. He sounded genuinely confused. "Well, you know," Izuku flustered, gesturing wildly. "Bad luck and, well, anything don't really go together." He shrugged his shoulders helplessly. and it wouldn't be the first time that my bad luck has caused me to fail something. He drifted off, recalling various times where the weirdest happenstances had caused him to fail an assignment. All Might gave him a sympathetic smile. Well, I can assure you, young Midoriya, that you passed on your own merits, with no help from luck, nor myself. He said it with such vigor, such confidence that Izuku could only nod his head in agreement. I guess. Izuku hiked up his shoulders and shrugged. But still, I know I just got one for all, but I can't control it at all. He looked up at All Might, something like desperation in his eyes. I broke my bones using it. I get an amazing power like yours, and I can't even use it. I'm going to stop you right there, All Might said, finality sitting like a stone in his voice. Of course you can't control it, he stated as if it was the most obvious thing. You had it for less than a day when you used it. You can't give someone that kind of power and expect them to know how to control it immediately. Izuku gazed at him expectantly. It made sense. If he thought about it, he had practically had this quirk given to him, and then not even 3 hours later, he had been in a situation where he had been forced to use it at full capacity when he didn't even know how to do that. Of course, there were going to be repercussions. He just hadn't thought breaking his bones was going to be one of them. Sighing, "You're right," he relented. There was no point to continue arguing over something as trivial as that. So anyway, he changed topics, shifting his position in the sand. "You got a job teaching at UA." There was an awkward air between them now. "I did," he offered simply, and Izuku kicked the dirt. "The staff already knows of my predicament, though they do not know of our connection. And you'd like to keep it that way?" Izuku guessed. He shouldn't be surprised. If word were to get out that All Might's quirk could be transferred, or that a young soon-to-be UE student now had it, well, he could only imagine. All Might nodded his head. "Yes, that would be ideal." "I suppose that means that even my mom can't know?" he asked. He hated lying to his mom, but if he had to, he would. Again, he was given a sympathetic look from All Might. Yes, that would be for the best. Izuku heaved a sigh. "I guess." He gazed out past All Might, at the sea, and watched as it methodically pushed and pulled the tide. "If I can't tell anyone about it, I'll just lie about it. Say it's just a strength-enhancing quirk, a mutation, or something." All Might, for some reason or another, found it necessary to turn back into his hero form and gave him a thumbs up. Maybe it was for the effect, or maybe he just liked being in that form. But either way, some random person who happened to be on the beach at the time noticed them and shouted out, "Is that All Might?" spitting out blood. All Might sputtered. This was a mistake. "Come, young Midoriya, we must leave." He started to race down the beach, not bothering to wait for him. Izuku ran after him. "You just had to change into that form, didn't you?" The sarcasm was thick in his tone. All Might turned away, shamefaced. "I don't know what came over me." Izuku just shook his head. He figured it didn't really matter. Maybe his quirk had taken effect and compelled All Might to do something completely idiotic. Or maybe All Might, in the heat of the moment, had forgotten the dangers of changing his form like that and did it anyway. Then a thought struck Izuku. There was no reason for him to be running with All Might. Sure, they had been spotted together, but really, he could just go home. He didn't need to escape fans like All Might did. "Wait, why am I running away with you?" All Might didn't give him an answer. He just kept running away. Izuku shook his head and stopped, turned tail and started running the opposite direction. "See you later, All Might." He grinned, satisfied with the day's events, as he headed home. Today was the day. Today was his first day of high school. His first day in the heroics class. He was nervous, a little more than nervous actually. He couldn't stop trembling as he attempted to tie his tie for the 5th time. It really shouldn't be this difficult. And yet, the tie just refused to work with him. He knew how to tie a tie, damn it. So, why was it being so difficult? You know what? He gave up on his endeavor. "I give up. No one will care anyway," he reasoned. He walked to his door and opened it, leaving the room before immediately going back in to grab his backpack. He left his room once again, only to return moments later because he forgot his house keys. He left again, and repeated the process, this time for his phone. Finally, he had grabbed everything and was heading for the door to leave. His mom stopped him though and asked him if he had everything, which he was positive he did since he had gone back into his room 3 times to grab things he forgot. He figured if he forgot anything now then he was just meant to not have it. He went to put his shoes on when his mom stopped him one last time. "Izuku," she was beaming with pride, "I am so proud of you." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before bringing him into a hug. He smiled graciously at that. He knew his mom worried about him and it felt nice to know he hadn't screwed this up. Yet, his mind supplied. No, he wasn't going to think like that. He had earned his spot here and he was going to prove it. The glass was half full. "Have a good first day of school, honey. Love you," his mom said, a smile on her face. He nodded, a bright smile adorning his own. "I will. Love you too, Mom." With that, he opened the door and left. He made it to the stairs before he recalled something. Sighing, he turned heel and strode back up to the door. This was ridiculous, he thought as he opened the door. "Back so soon? What'd you forget?" He could hear the smile in his mom's tone. He bit back his frustrations as he replied, "My ID, for school. It's in my room." He knew he was prone to forgetting things, but this was getting absurd. It was the 4th time he was going back to his room for something. He rolled his eyes as he spotted the ID card on his desk. Of course, it was tauntingly out in the open. Quickly, he grabbed it and headed out to leave. Again, at this rate he was going to miss the train, which he could absolutely not afford to do. He was farther away than his middle school had been. He didn't know the route well enough to chance missing the train. He said goodbye to his mom once again and left, closing the door a little harsher than necessary. He flinched at the sound. Maybe he was a little peeved at the moment, but he needed to scale it back. He hadn't thought he closed the door that aggressively. As he made his way down the stairs, managing to not trip, he thought about his new school. He wondered if they would be like his old classmates, once they knew his quirk. Though, he thought, now he had 2 quirks. Did he really need to tell them his other quirk? Everyone had bad luck every once in a while. Would anyone even notice if their class had a little more bad luck than normal? Probably not, but the thought still disconcerted him. He didn't want to lie to his classmates. He couldn't deal with it if yet another class shunned him for his quirk. This was his new start. This was his shot. He didn't want it all to go away because of his cursed quirk. So lost in thought he didn't even notice there was a man on his cell phone until he ran into him. They both went down. Izuku was quicker at pulling himself together than the man was, and so he helped him up. Or he tried to at least. "I don't want your help, you damned brat." The man swatted at his offered hand. "You've done this many times before." Izuku flinched at that, because he had, in fact, run into this man on many occasions. It wasn't his fault that this man stood by the stairs every day, reading the newspaper, drinking coffee, or talking on the cell phone. It was just his fault that he managed to trip, fall, or run into him every other day. "It's like you're cursed or something." The man finished, getting up, without Izuku's help, and walking away, his gait oozing annoyance. Ouch, that hurt. He was used to kids calling him a curse because of his quirk, and some adults were wary of his presence. But he'd never had an adult spit in his face that he was cursed. He wasn't cursed, it was just his quirk. Well, maybe he was cursed then. Cursed to have an unlucky quirk that would only ever cause him misfortune. Before he could delve any deeper into self-deprecating thoughts, something rubbed against his leg. He looked down to see 𝗧𝗧𝗏, purring and slinking herself in an infinite loop around his legs. Seeing 𝗧𝗧𝗏 here made him forget about the somewhat awful morning he's had. "Awfully affectionate today, aren't we?" he noted as she preened. "𝗧𝗏𝗏, I appreciate the affection, I really do. But," he glanced at his phone, checking the time, "I really have to go." 𝗧𝗏𝗏 stopped rubbing against his leg and regarded him with her immaculate golden eyes. She gave an inquisitive 𝗵𝗲. Izuku just shook his head and started running in the direction of the train station. Unsurprisingly so, 𝗧𝗏𝗏 started running after him. Izuku paced, waiting for the train to arrive. It was due any minute now. He had made it to the train station with time to spare, which caught him a little off guard. He wasn't used to being early for anything, unless, of course, he wanted to be late. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 was by his side, sitting regally as they waited for the train to arrive. He had, rather unsuccessfully, tried to shoo her away as she wouldn't be able to go on the train with him. She didn't seem to care as she just sat right next to him, tail flicking to and fro. It was only a few minutes later when the train arrived and he tried to board it. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 followed him. 𝗧𝗏𝗏, he looked down at her. "No, go home." He turned and took a step forward. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 followed him. He turned to her and she meowed. 𝗧𝗏𝗏, he pointed towards the exit of the train station. "Go home. I'm sure your owners are worried about you. You've been gone a lot lately." 𝗧𝗏𝗏 regarded him with unbelieving eyes and 𝗵𝗲 again. "No, you're not coming on the train with me." 𝗧𝗏𝗏 remained where she was, tail twirling with defiance. 𝗧𝗏𝗏, he sighed. "I can't take you on the train with me. It's against the rules." Still, 𝗧𝗏𝗏 didn't budge. Izuku huffed in annoyance, leaning down to her level. "𝗧𝗏𝗏, I know you want to follow me, but you can't. They don't allow animals on the train." He pointed to the exit. "You have to go home." Izuku let out a long sigh as he stood on the train. He couldn't believe he had just snuck a cat on the train with him. He could feel 𝗧𝗏𝗏 writhing around in his backpack and shook his head solemnly. This was a mistake. With his luck, he was going to be caught. He had snuck a cat on the train with him. There were so many ways this could go wrong. And yet, everything was going smoothly. He wanted to keep it that way. He tried to keep his quirk in check, which came a little easier than he expected. Maybe it was because of his excitement, or maybe he was just getting better at control. He was starting to think that he may even arrive to class early when the train lurched to a stop. He was thrown forward a little, not expecting the sudden stop. He heard the intercom announce that there were some technical difficulties and his heart sank. Leave it to his quirk to ruin everything. From within his backpack, 𝗧𝗏𝗏 grumbled. He whispered back to her as discreetly as possible, "You don't get to be snide. You're the one who just had to come with me." There was soft mew in reply. Izuku took it as 𝗧𝗏𝗏 begrudgingly agreeing with him. Izuku smiled faintly at 𝗧𝗏𝗏's relenting. Someone tapped on his shoulder, causing him to jolt before he turned to see a man. "You go to Yui, kid?" he asked gruffly. Izuku startled. "Yeah." He was a little perturbed by the man, if only because he wasn't sure why he was talking to him or how he knew he was a student at 𝐻𝐢. Your uniform? The man supplied easily. It's the same one my kid wears. He's a third year though. There was a hint of pride in his voice. Nervously, Izuku nodded his head. Is that so? The man nodded. Yes. He then regarded Izuku with a disbelieving stare. What happened to your tie? Izuku looked down at the crumpled mess that was his tie. He gave a nonchalant shrug. Ties just don't get along with me. I see. Well then. The train started to lurch forward and they began moving again. Well, I do hope your first day goes well. Dumbly, Izuku nodded. That was odd, he thought. He was a little miffed that the man commented on his tie-tying abilities though, because as far as he was concerned, it didn't matter if he could tie a tie. It wasn't like it was a big deal. He didn't let himself dwell on it any longer though. Waiting for them to reach his destination, he took out his phone and checked the newsfeed, hoping to pass the time and ward off any potential conversationalist with his clear show of indifference. Somehow, Izuku didn't end up being late. In fact, he arrived at 𝐻𝐢 with a few minutes to spare. He let 𝗧𝗵𝗃 out of his backpack, only then realizing the predicament he was in. He couldn't bring 𝗧𝗵𝗃 into the school with him, but he couldn't leave her here either. She didn't know this area, and she also was missing a leg. Even if she had grown accustomed to living with only 3 legs, she was still at a disadvantage. This was a conundrum. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, he began, giving her a lost look. You can't follow me in. You'll have to wait here. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 ever so gracefully replied by sitting down, ignoring him completely, and then began to bathe herself. Alrighty then. Izuku huffed out. I'll make sure to find you after class, okay? 𝗧𝗵𝗃 meowed offhandedly and Izuku wasn't sure, but he thought she was snickering at him. He shook his head as he turned to enter the building, fear and anticipation taking hold of him. He was really here, at 𝐻𝐢. Someone like him had actually made it into the hero class. He had proved himself capable at the exams. But it wasn't enough. That was just one exam. If he wanted to be a true pro, he needed more than to pass some test. He needed to prove every day that he was cut out for the job. As he walked through the halls, looking for his class, he wondered who would be in his class. He was kind of hoping that girl from the exam would be there. She had been nice, and he wanted to get to know her more, maybe even be friends with her. It took some time to find the classroom as he didn't know exactly where he was going. He had gone into the wrong room a few times, chuckling nervously as he exited them, tripping on more than one occasion. At one point, he ended up in one of the storage room in the basement. He had no idea how that happened, but eventually, he did find the right classroom with just barely a few minutes to spare. He took a deep breath and opened the door. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he should have guessed 𝗵𝘃𝗃 would be there, yelling at that same guy from the entrance exam, the one who had called him out. Yeah, he thought unenthusiastically. Of all the classes in all the schools in all the world, he just had to be in mine. Izuku mumbled, hoping no one would hear him. Deku, 𝗵𝘃𝗃 growled, anger sparking up in his voice. What are you doing here? Izuku was about to answer, when the other guy cut him off, his tone curious. But stale as that were you. Did you just twist an iconic quote from a classic movie to fit circumstances? Izuku stopped and stared at him. All he could do was nod. He couldn't believe someone actually got the reference. He had said this quote many a times, but no one had ever understood the reference, which saddened him because it was a classic quote from an iconic movie from ages ago. Then again, it was a movie from the West. Western movies weren't as popular here, but then, this guy had recognized it. Maybe he had misjudged this guy. Izuku knew he didn't always give off the best first impression, so perhaps he shouldn't be quite so hasty in his internal assessment of this guy. He mentally shook those thoughts from his head as he replied, taking a chance by referencing this movie once again. Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. My name isn't Louis. It's Ida Tenya. Izuku wilted a little bit. Maybe he should have just stuck with the one reference, but then Ida continued, but I can appreciate the reference. And also, I would like to apologize for my previous actions. Now Izuku was confused. He furrowed his brow. Okay. Was he referring to when he falsely accused him of trying to undermine that girl? Ida continued, his voice and posture portraying nothing but seriousness. I misjudged you before the exam, but it seems as though you understood the true meaning of the exam, something I myself was blind to. I did. Izuku did not know what he was talking about. True nature of the exam. 𝗵𝘃𝗃 seemed to grow restless at their conversation and interrupted before Ida could explain further. Will you two nerds shut the hell up? It's bad enough I have to deal with Deku. He sent a heated glare at Izuku. I don't want to have to deal with another shitty nerd. Ida turned to 𝗵𝘃𝗃, and using a wild hand gesture, he berated 𝗵𝘃𝗃 for his behavior. It was something Izuku had never seen before. Someone was holding 𝗵𝘃𝗃 accountable for his actions. That didn't happen. At least, Izuku had never seen anyone ever tell 𝗵𝘃𝗃 he was wrong. His thoughts were interrupted by someone tapping his shoulder. He jumped at the unexpected touch. He turned to see the vibrant smile of the girl who had been kind to him at the exam. Oh good, it is you. she exclaimed enthusiastically. His eyes went wide at her declaration. She seemed so enthused to see him. He wasn't used to that. Aye. He stuttered. She just smiled and nodded to herself. Izuku found it a little weird, before turning and responding, I'm glad you got in too. I would have felt terrible if you didn't make it into the hero course. A sudden voice, deadpan and flat, spoke up from behind them. This is the Department of Heroics. If you're just here to chat, please do it elsewhere. They both looked down to see a man, with tremendous bags under his eyes, lying on the floor in a yellow sleeping bag. Everyone in the room quieted whatever conversations they were in to look at the man. He did look rather odd. As the class settled down, the man got up and out of the sleeping bag and walked to the center of the classroom. Izuku and the girl, whom he still didn't know the name of, turned and watched him, not daring to move. All right, everyone. The man started dully, posture slacked and eyes dull. He looked dead on his feet if Izuku was being honest. I'm 𝐳𝐻𝗵𝗲, your homeroom teacher. He was interrupted by the scuffling coming from his sleeping bag. Almost lazily, a cat dragged itself out of the sleeping bag, yawning contentedly. Is that a cat, sensei? The girl beside Izuku said, pointing as the cat stretched its 3 legs. Izuku glowered at the cat. Leave it to 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to find a way into the school. He could have sworn 𝗧𝗵𝗲 gave him a cheeky grin as she lazily went to Aizawa. There's sensei. Aizawa glared at all of them. Yes, I found her outside the building. I think I'm going to keep her. She's very affectionate for a stray. That's because she's not a stray, Izuku stated, crossing his arms and shaking his head at the cat. You know this cat? There was judgment in his question, but Izuku was more concerned with 𝗧𝗵𝗲's antics to notice. He nodded. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 lives a few blocks from me, but she's kinda attached to me, you could say, he explained. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, loving all this attention, rode and hobbled up to Izuku, where she rubbed against his leg and purred. Izuku smiled sheepishly. Aizawa stared at him. Or maybe it was a glare. Izuku couldn't tell from his blank expression. I see. He turned to the rest of the class. Well, now that we've cleared up the mystery of the cat, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. There was a drawl in his voice, as if speaking took more energy than he had. All of you. He focused his gaze on everyone in the room. Put on your gym uniforms and meet me outside. With that, Aizawa left the room. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 meowed in a manner that Izuku knew to be sassy and directed at him before she strutted out after the teacher. Izuku just shook his head as he went with the rest of the class to the changing rooms to put their uniform on. Izuku nervously tugged at his gym uniform as he made his way outside with the rest of the class. Of course, his uniform didn't fit quite right. It wasn't like it was too big or too small, it more or less just felt off, like the dimensions of it weren't correct. It was a small issue really. And it wasn't noticeable, just a small inconvenience, something he could easily live with, before anyone could ask anything about why they were out here. And not at the opening ceremony for first years, their sensei, Aizawa, started to speak. I'll cut right to it. This is a quirk assessment test. He turned to meet everyone's gaze. And 𝗧𝗵𝗲, in her true cat fashion, sat right next to his feet, ears poised and tail flicking in a judgmental manner. You're in the hero course, and so that means it's my job to teach you how to achieve that goal. We don't have time for nonsense, so right now I will determine if you have what it takes to continue on this path. There was a collective intake of breath as Aizawa said this. In middle school, Aizawa continued, walking towards the baseball pitch, you all had standard tests. In them you weren't allowed to use your quirks. But now, he stopped abruptly, a wicked gleam in his eyes. 𝗵𝘃𝗲, how far could you throw a softball pitch in middle school? There was scoff from 𝗵𝘃𝗲. 67 meters, he replied dryly. Aizawa took out a softball and tossed it to 𝗵𝘃𝗲, who caught it on reflex. Show me how far you can throw it now. He gestured to the pitch he was standing on. With a disgruntled 𝗵𝗃𝗲, 𝗵𝘃𝗲 stalked forward until he was standing where Aizawa had instructed. Oh, and use your quirk this time, Aizawa mentioned in an offhanded nature. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 smirked before throwing the ball, his explosive side coming full force when he initiated his quirk. The ball went flying through the air, a burning, flame-ridden streak that left a trail of smoke as it soared through the sky and landed far beyond their line of vision. Aizawa held up his phone to display a number written on it. See this? 67 meters. That was what you said you could do, but when you use your quirk, 705.2 meters. He paused for a moment, heightening the suspense. In order to become a great hero, you need to know what you're capable of first, know your limits so that you can work on breaking them. I've set up multiple physical tests that you should know from middle school, but this time, I'm allowing you to use your quirks and show me the best you've got. Beside him, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 purred, rubbing up against his leg. It kind of ruined the moment, Izuku thought, but it was definitely a 𝗧𝗵𝗲 thing to do. She was a very needy cat. There were whispers from his classmates, talking about how they would finally be able to use their quirks. This sounds like fun, he heard one person say in a cheery voice. It was not a great thing to say, it seemed, as Aizawa turned on them. Fun? This isn't some fun little activity that you can half-ass. I'm training you to be future heroes, not babysitting you so you can have a grand old time. If you're not going to take this seriously, then leave. This isn't a game, and if you're going to treat it like one, then you shouldn't be here." His voice was cold and harsh as he spat out, "You should consider yourselves lucky to be here. But if you're all going to treat this like a game, then I guess I'll up the ante. The person who performs worst in these physical assessments will be expelled, effective immediately." Everyone stopped laughing and joking around, but Izuku was gritting his teeth. He didn't care about the being expelled part. Well, he did care about that a lot, but that wasn't what upset him so much. He had worked so hard to prove he could do this, to show the world he was capable of being something. Then Aizawa, his teacher, on the first day tells him everything he's worked so hard to achieve is just luck. It didn't sit right with him. If there was one thing Izuku knew, it was that he was not lucky. In fact, he fought against luck to be standing here right now. Luck had been against him, and he had denied it again and again. He wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. He clenched his fists and bit his lip. "I'm not here because of luck," he bit it out bitterly, not registering that he was even voicing his thoughts aloud. Everyone stilled when he said that. It had been shocking to hear that one of them was going to be expelled. But no one had dared speak out against their teacher, not when his tone had been so stern, his gaze so serious. "What was that you said, Midoriya?" He shivered at the ice in his words, before stealing his convictions. He could just as easily back down on this, apologize and move on. But something stopped him. Sure, he could do that, and it may be the easier and smarter option, but he couldn't do it. Luck was not the reason he was standing where he was today. His quirk was bad luck, so in a sense, yes, luck had played a role. But he wasn't by any means lucky to be here. He was here because he fought for it. There were things he couldn't control, things that people may call luck, and he knew that. Everyone dealt with these unforeseen circumstances. But Izuku couldn't stand the thought that all his hard work and training was going to be blown off as something as mundane as luck. He held his conviction as he spoke. "I said I'm not here because I'm lucky." He glared at Aizawa, who, in turn, sent a cold stare his way. "Oh, so why are you here then?" It was a challenge. Anger burned at Izuku's throat, wanting to escape, but he swallowed it. "I'm here because I worked hard to be here." "And what about the other people? The ones who didn't get in? Did they not work just as hard as you? Were they not just as deserving as you to be here?" Izuku stopped and thought about it. He wasn't as pompous to say that there weren't other people who took that exam who weren't just as deserving as him, but the difference between him and them was that he passed. It was crude and a bit harsh, but the fact remained, he had passed that exam and they hadn't. I'm not saying that. There were definitely people who took that exam who were worthy of being heroes. But that's not the only thing there is to being a hero. You can't just want to be one. That's not enough. He looked down, thinking back to that day on the roof, when he had asked All Might if he could be a hero. He swallowed. He was starting to understand why All Might had held his position. But he still felt it was wrong. Anyone could be a hero, but you had to work at it. Well, Aizawa seemed intrigued, yet slightly annoyed by his monologue. Izuku looked at him. Determination set in his green eyes. If you want to be a hero, you have to work at it, and you have to push through every inconvenience. You can't let yourself stop because something goes wrong. I took that exam just as everyone else did. I was faced with my own inconveniences there, but you know why I passed? Izuku waited a second to let the tension build. "I passed," he continued, voice strong and steady, "because when I was faced with an obstacle I didn't run away. I ran straight at it. I did what I needed to do, not what I wanted to do." No one said a word, but there was a collective intake of breath. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't even known he was holding. Aizawa was grinning like a madman at him. "I see. Well, if you're so confident in your abilities, then show me." He gestured to the baseball pitch and offered Izuku another softball. Izuku wondered how many softballs Aizawa had, and where he was getting them. Izuku stepped up to the field and took the ball. "Show me what you can do." Izuku got ready to throw the ball. He couldn't use his inborn quirk here. It wouldn't help him in the least. He would have to use one for all. He didn't have a choice. Sure, he would break his arm, but there wasn't anything else he could do. If he didn't use a quirk, it would undermine everything he had just said. It would be him running away and giving up. He wouldn't allow it. He let the golden fire burn through his veins. Feeling one for all's power flowing through him, he positioned himself to throw the ball. As he was throwing the ball, he felt all the power pour out of him, extending into his throw. It was as if a huge tension on his bones had suddenly been released, snapping his body back into place with harrowing force. The ball left his hand and didn't go nearly as far as he had intended it to. In fact, as the ball sliced through the air, a strong gust of wind blew in the opposite direction and stopped the ball, carrying it backwards a good few meters before it landed a mere 20 meters out. He stared at the ball, frozen in shock. This wasn't right. He had fired up one for all. So why didn't it work? Slowly, he turned to see Aizawa staring at him intensely with his eyes wide and his hair sticking up as if gravity had stopped working. His eyes glowed a vicious red, and his scarf, once wrapped around his neck loosely, now flew out in all directions as if it were sentient. All former exhaustion had drained from his sensei's face, leaving a haggard, stone-cold expression. How was it that you managed to pass the exams again? By overcoming adversity. By going for it when others faltered. His voice stung like a wasp, leaving a lasting impression upon him. All I've seen is an uncanny amount of strength and a whole lot of luck. Aizawa was throwing back everything he had just said in his face. Izuku gritted his teeth. He wasn't lucky. He refused to belittle his hard work by calling it luck. Not when all his life, everything he's done, every accomplishment he's ever had, has been attributed to his quirk. Every time something happened to him, without fail, his classmates or teacher or adults told him that he didn't actually earn it, that it only happened because his bad luck spread to everyone else. Izuku was tired of luck being the determining factor for him. It wasn't. His quirk may manifest luck, but that didn't mean that it held any sway over his achievements and downfalls. Despite his internal thoughts swirling, Izuku remained quiet as Aizawa persisted. I saw what happened to your arm in those exams. You spout on about how you don't stop when things get bad, but if you incapacitate yourself every time you use your quirk, you'll be useless. What happens when you're fighting an actual villain and you hurt yourself? What then? Because of your recklessness, you would have endangered yourself and everyone else in the area. You can't be a hero with a quirk like that. Izuku froze at those words. That wasn't. No, he refused. He had already decided that he was going to be a hero. He wasn't going to stop because yet another adult told him he couldn't. Slowly, but without any hesitation, Izuku steadied his gaze on Aizawa. It's not a matter of if I can become a hero, because it doesn't matter if you think I can be one. All that matters is that I will become one. I've decided that. And your jibes at me are nothing new. Izuku wasn't sure where all this confidence came from, but he was tired of being a coward. This was a chance for him to be something else, to be something better. I've been told all my life what I can't be. Your insults are nothing special. Tell me what I can't be, and I'll show you that I can. There was a joking playfulness laced within Aizawa's bitter tone, a challenge laden deep within his words. You haven't even done any of the other assessments yet. Do you think you can do them all with a broken hand, or were all your pretty words just that? Pretty words. Show me, Midoriya, what can you do? What can you do? That phrase has been thrown at him for years, ever since he first showed signs of his quirk. It had really hurt to hear it then, when he hadn't a clue how to control his quirk. Then, he had screwed up. He had really screwed up. And he thought he'd never be able to be a hero with his quirk. Now he had people who believed in him. He had a reason to prove everyone wrong. He was given another softball to throw. He knew he couldn't use one for all recklessly like he had before, but he couldn't control it yet either. Bad luck wouldn't really help him here, unless he could try that. He knew Aizawa was waiting to see if he had anything up his sleeve, or if he was truly all bark and no bite. If he didn't make this, if this didn't work, he had no doubt that he would be the one that Aizawa expelled. He couldn't control one for all yet, but he could direct it, he could contain it so that his entire arm didn't break. He concentrated on his quirks, trying to rein in one for all and halt his bad luck. He focused on pinpointing his quirk. He could feel the energy rush through him, racing to his hand before he threw the ball. He waited until the ball was about to leave his hand before activating one for all. The ball streaked through the air. Izuku's finger exploded with agony. This hurt a lot more than breaking his arm did. He sucked in a breath and turned to see Aizawa staring at him in shock. He heard a collective gasp from the rest of the class and noticed that they weren't looking at him, rather at the sky. He turned to see a bird. A big raptor had grabbed the ball he threw in midair and started to fly away from them. He couldn't help it. He chuckled, then gasped as another pulse of pain rang through him. Aizawa quipped up, voice flat. It seems as though we won't know how far you threw the ball. As a bird took it. Izuku chuckled slightly, trying to stave off the pain a little. Well, it's not like it's my fault a bird took the ball. I guess you could say it's just a stroke of bad luck. He gave Aizawa a wily smile. Though pain twisted it a little, his finger really did hurt. Aizawa sighed exasperatedly at his jibe, but became more concerned when Izuku continued to wince. Are you sure you're okay, Midoriya? His voice conveyed a hint of suspicion within it. Izuku snapped his eyes open. This pain was nothing. It hurt, yes, but he could power through it. This is nothing, I can still perform. Besides, he wiped away the tears that had forced themselves from his eyes. There's no crying in baseball. Oh ho, Aizawa smirked. Before gesturing towards the rest of the class, you may have shown that you can throw a ball, but let's see where you fare in the rest of the assessment. Izuku nodded his head and started to head back. And one more thing, Midoriya. Izuku turned a questioning gaze on him. This isn't a baseball. It was a softball with an irritated sigh. Izuku rolled his eyes. Why do I even bother? He muttered darkly as he walked back to the rest of the group. All through the rest of the assessments, Bakugo kept glaring at him, his eyes so intense Izuku could have sworn he saw actual smoke coming from them at one point. He knew Bakugo was mad at him for the ball throw. When he had finally gotten the distance, his ball had gone 750 meters. Breaking Bakugo's record by a solid 42.8 meters. Bakugo had complained to Aizawa about it, stating that he had cheated because the bird had taken the ball and brought it farther along than it should have gone. But Aizawa just brushed him off, stating that there wasn't anything he could do. In all honesty, Izuku knew there was plenty that Aizawa could do. It just appeared as though he didn't want to do anything about it. The thought made Izuku snicker. Izuku worried, though, that he hadn't done enough to evade expulsion. There really wasn't anything he could use his quirks for unless he wanted to sabotage his classmates with enough bad luck to counter his own. But there was no way he was going to do that. He was trying to be a hero, and sabotaging his classmates would undermine his beliefs. He still felt bad about his stunt at the entrance exams. He hadn't really meant to trip everybody. It had just been a heat of the moment kind of thing. And he regretted it, though there wasn't anything he could do about it now. When the assessments had finished, Aizawa told them he would show them their scores. He waited a few minutes, calculating the final scores, before displaying them all on the board. Izuku slowly looked at the scoreboard, cringing when he saw where his name was. He had placed last. Dead last. He balled his hands into a fist, his right hand less so as the finger was still broken. Oh yeah, Aizawa added nonchalantly, as if it were an afterthought, that whole expulsion thing. It was a logical ruse. He laughed unironically. No one laughed with him. Izuku let out a breath of relief. He wasn't going to be expelled. He could still continue on his journey to become a hero. He was a little miffed at Aizawa for lying to them, but his relief over not being expelled outweighed his strife over the lie. After the shock had worn off, Aizawa told them to go back to the classroom. He stopped Izuku, though, as he was walking, and told him to go to the nurse to heal his broken finger. He simply nodded and headed towards the building. It was only after he had made it into the building that he realized he had no idea where the nurse's office was. The end of the day had arrived, and Izuku just felt exhausted. He knew, in reality, that it was because of the nurse's quirk, but he was mentally tired as well. He sighed as he made his way out of the school, briefly wondering where 𝗧𝗧𝗏 had taken off to. He hadn't seen her since the assessment. He shook his head at the thought. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 would be fine. He immediately regretted the action, as in his tired state it just made him dizzy. So out of it, he didn't notice the person walking up behind him until he felt a hand on his shoulder. Instinctively, he jumped and turned to see it was 𝗳𝗏. Sorry if I scared you. I just wanted to ask if your finger had healed, he inquired diligently. Izuku stuttered out a response. Oh, yeah, recovery girl. You know the nurse, she healed me all up. He wasn't used to classmates caring about his overall well-being. He had to say, it was nice. Ah, that's good. He walked up next to Izuku, walking in stride with him. I must say, though, that whole stunt Aizawa pulled, it really got me. Yeah, I was really nervous that I was gonna get expelled, especially with how I kinda ranted at him. Izuku's nervous nature returned full force, causing him to wilt in on himself slightly. Ida shook his head. Quite the contrary, I think. Huh, what do you mean? While, yes, you were a bit directive, I think it just proved how driven you were, and how much you cared about being here. There was a note in his voice, something almost like jealousy. And then you went and proved that you could adapt to situations quickly. There's no way he would have expelled you after that. You have proved, once again, that you have the qualities of a hero. Ada, he was cut off by the same girl from earlier, the one he really needed to get the name of. Hey guys, are you going to the train station too? There was a soft mew that followed her sentence, and Izuku turned to see her holding 𝗧𝗏𝗏, who was, surprisingly, letting her do so. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 loved attention, but hated to be held. You're that infinity girl, Ida exclaimed, shifting his glasses. The girl blushed slightly. My name is actually Uraraka Ochako. You're Ida Tenya, right? Ida nodded, and she continued looking at Izuku. And you're Midoriya. Deku. In her arms, he heard 𝗧𝗏𝗏 snicker. At least he took it as her snickering. His face went red with embarrassment. That's not actually my name. It's Izuku, not Deku. Bakugo just likes to call me that as a sort of insult. Her face went a little solemn at the mention of that, but quickly went back to her peppy, cheery mood. Really? 'Cause I think Deku has a nice ring to it. Something like, I'll never give up, and after that speech you gave, I think that really fits. Oh, this was new. Deku had always been an insult, meant to tell him how worthless he was. But now someone was telling him it meant something different. The last thing Izuku wanted was for things to be the same. To be the same Deku as he had been in middle school. But now, maybe it could be different. Maybe he could still be Deku, but not Deku. He could change the meaning of it. It could mean something else now. He smiled at the thought. Yeah, I suppose it does. He nodded, assuring himself, yeah, you can call me Deku. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 yawned, stretching as much as she could in Uraraka's hold. "Oh, yeah, this was your cat, right?" she asked. Izuku nodded. "Well, yeah, kinda. It's weird. She's not mine, but she follows me around a lot." "Interesting name, 𝗧𝗵𝗲," Ida remarked. "I like it. It sounds cute." Uraraka huffed. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 wrote in agreement. "Yes, well, for a black cat she is very unlucky. Hence why I gave her a lucky name." Izuku sighed, taking a step forward, not noticing the divot in the sidewalk and face planting into the ground. "And you seem to be a bit unlucky as well," Ada noted. Uraraka laughed. "He did the same thing at the entrance exam," she said as she went to help him up. "You seem to fall a lot." Izuku couldn't help but smile. Yes, he trailed off. Part of him wanted to tell them about his quirk, his first one, but another part, a darker part, told him to keep it a secret. If they knew, they would leave him, call him cursed, just as everyone else did. Sometimes it feels that way. They didn't need to know his actual quirk. Not yet, at least. It wasn't important. And besides, Izuku thought as Uraraka helped him up, he liked this feeling. Having friends who he could have a casual conversation with. It was nice. Say, Midoriya. Ida started as they made their way to the train station. Earlier, on the pitch, was that a reference to a movie I heard? Izuku beamed. Finally, someone who understood all his references. Yes, A League of Their Own. Yes, finally, someone who knows of them. I know they're, like, ancient, but I used to watch those old movies all the time. They were basically my childhood, as well as Heroes and such. Izuku babbled on. Yes, I agree. I, too, have watched many of those old classics from the West. Not many people know of them these days, but every once in a while, I'll catch a reference or two. Uraraka looked between the two of them. Classic movies? I've never heard of A League of Their Own. Both Ida and Izuku stopped and turned to her. Well, you just have to see them now. Uraraka smiled at the prospect, and they continued their conversation all the way to the train station. Izuku was smiling and laughing the entire time. Friends weren't something he had ever had before, but now, things were different. It was a good different, a different he could get used to. Izuku had survived his first day as Yui. Though it had gone a little differently than he had hoped, it hadn't been bad by any means. His mom had been happy to hear his recount of the day, elated over the fact that he had managed to make some friends. It had been a pretty exciting endeavor, and for the first time in a long time, Izuku was excited to go back the next day. Though this time, he did make sure that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 didn't follow him into the train station. Izuku knew he was bound to get caught if he kept sneaking her on the train with him. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 hadn't liked it, and some part of Izuku knew she would try and follow him anyway. But for now, the fresh can of tuna he had left for her was working. Izuku was excited. Today would be his first day of actual classes, and he couldn't wait to see what the hero course had to offer. His morning classes were all regular classes, such as English with Present Mike. It wasn't bad, a bit mundane, but the novelty of being in the presence of so many pro heroes still hadn't worn off yet. While the teachers had been impressive, the classes themselves had been anything but. While he was fine with nothing out of the ordinary happening, it had made the day kind of dull. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, something Izuku wasn't exactly used to. The day had been going well. Nothing terrible had happened, so, of course, when lunch rolled around, that was all bound to change. He had met up with Ida and Uraraka for lunch, happy to have friends to eat with for once. He was used to eating alone, away from everyone else. Things were different now, though. They had been in the middle of a conversation about their English class and how enthusiastic Present Mike had been during it. When they were disturbed, someone came up behind them. He was wearing the hero course uniform, but he wasn't from their class. So Izuku deduced that he must have been from Class 1B. He didn't wait for an opening to announce his presence. So, you're Class 1A. It wasn't asked as a question, instead stated in an unimpressed tone. He was smiling, but there was hatred in his eyes. Izuku's smile faltered. Those were the same eyes that people looked at him with all their lives as if he were cursed. An old fear drove a frigid spike through him at the memory. Beside him, Uraraka stilled, and Ada glared sternly at the newcomer. He didn't wait for a response before continuing. You know, you're not all that impressive. Just because you're in Class 1 it doesn't make you better than us in Class 1B. He maniacally laughed, danger flitting in his cold, gray orbs. Izuku just gave him a pointed, albeit a little confused, look. No one here thinks we're better than you. He gestured to the three of them, and they nodded in succession. There was a disgruntled 𝗵𝗃. Don't get too big of a head, Class 1A. Just because you have some flashy quirk doesn't mean you can look down on us. He gave them a pompous look. Izuku just looked at Ada and Uraraka, all three of them sharing confused looks. Izuku could already tell he was going to regret saying this, but, you know that, technically, we're looking up at you right now. Like, he pointed at them, sitting at the table, then to him, standing, looking down on them in both senses. You're standing, and we're sitting so. Besides, we would never look down on you anyway. We're all trying to become heroes. He trailed off into an incoherent mumble, afraid he had said the wrong thing. Thankfully, Ada backed him up. Midoriya is right. There is no reason for us to look down on you if you aim to be a hero, just like us. Yeah, Uraraka chimed in. There's no reason we can't all be heroes together. She pumped her fist into the air enthusiastically. The other student was not expecting such a reaction if his flustering was anything to go by. He pointedly glared at them, anger shining in his eyes before turning heel and strutting away, all the while grumbling about how he would show them not to mess with Class 1B. Once he had gone, Izuku looked at 𝗂𝗧𝗏 and 𝐒𝐴 and shrugged. That was weird. 𝗂𝗧𝗏 and 𝐒𝐴 both nodded in agreement, and they continued their lunch. Izuku sat at his desk, his foot tapping the floor anxiously. This was it. It was time for the heroics class, taught by All Might. He couldn't wait. He wondered what they were going to talk about today. It was only the first day. Surely it wouldn't be anything too strenuous like a battle simulation or anything. He was going through his analysis notes, just browsing over them and whatnot. He had found that going through his notebook was something he did whenever he was nervous. It gave him something to focus on, and as a fortunate outcome, it kept his terrible luck from spreading out to others. The class was just waiting for All Might to show up after all. He seemed to be running a bit late, so he didn't find any harm in going through his notes. He could hear a few murmurs from his classmates. All of them seemed eager to be working under the tutelage of the #1 hero. He couldn't blame them. All Might was something else. Even after knowing him for months, Izuku was still enamored by his heroic nature. When he was a child, he didn't have any friends, so he had turned to other sources to combat his loneliness. One way was through All Might and his heroic behavior, specifically his debut video, which really struck a chord with him. The other just happened to be movies from when the film industry was still new. They were practically antique in this day and age, but Izuku still found them enthralling. They had been unique to him, something he had never seen before, and there had been something about their plot, stories from before quirks had emerged, that he could identify with. He was brought out of his reverie when the door slammed open, and All Might himself came rushing in, wearing one of his Silver Age suits. "I am here." All Might sounded as enthusiastic as ever. "Welcome to the Hero Fundamentals class. Here you will learn the basics to what it takes to be a hero." He laughed heartily before continuing. "Let's jump right into it with a battle." That got mixed reviews from the class. While some people, such as 𝗵𝘃𝗀 and this one kid with red hair, shouted out their excitement, though 𝗵𝘃𝗀's shout-out was more of him sending off small explosions within his palms while the redhead downright shouted something about being manly. Others were quieter and more reserved in their responses. No one was downright against the idea, even if a few thought it to be rather odd, himself included. All Might wasn't done yet, it seemed, as he continued to talk, brash as ever, and he paused, most likely for dramatic effect. To go with the first battle, we have your hero costumes. Whatever reservations any of his classmates may have had were washed away at the prospect of getting to wear their hero suits. Izuku himself was quite excited to see about his own hero costume. He had gone over a few design elements with his mom, and he was pleased with the results. Izuku knew it would need work. There were a lot of things he would need to adjust as he got accustomed to his new power, but he had the framework down. All Might left them then, telling them to meet him at the ground beta after they had gotten changed into their suits. He was lagging behind the rest of them. It had taken him longer to get into his costume than it really should have, but that shouldn't have surprised him. Something was bound to go wrong, he knew that, but at the very least, he was glad that it hadn't been a hindrance to anyone besides himself. As he ran to catch up to everyone else, he adjusted the helmet on his head. He'd have to get the size adjusted as it didn't fit quite right. Otherwise, though, nothing else about his suit speculations had been off, which was of a surprise in and of itself. He didn't doubt the support class. He knew they would do an excellent job. However, things always went wrong around him, without fail. Well, they did forget about his shoes. But that was an easy mistake to fix. He had specifically asked that his shoes not have laces and instead have buckles because that would be harder to trip over. But they must have forgotten that part. He tried not to dwell on it. He had been able to remedy the situation easy enough by tying them in his signature quintuple knot. Izuku looked around once he had caught up to the rest of the group. Everyone's costumes looked interesting enough. He hoped they were as practical as they were stylish. He saw 𝗂𝗧𝗏 walking up to him. "Deku, I love your costume. It looks efficient." She regarded him with a smile. "Yeah?" he asked sheepishly. "I'm happy with it for the most part, though." He took the helmet off. "The helmet is a little too big for me, so I may have to get that readjusted before using it in an actual battle." She nodded her head in agreement. "Yeah, I get that. I kinda wish mine wasn't as puffy," and she looked down at her boots. "I don't know why they gave me heels here. They weren't in my sketch." She shrugged her shoulders. "All right." Their attention was pulled to All Might. "Let's see what you're made of with a trial of battle." Beside Izuku, 𝐒𝐴, whose suit closely resembled another hero that Izuku knew of, 𝗵𝗃𝗻, spoke up. "Sensei, I have a question regarding the battleground we'll be using. Is it, by any chance, the same mock city we used in the entrance exams?" All Might didn't falter in his response. Excellent question. However, contrary to popular belief, most criminal acts are committed indoors, and so we will have an indoor battle." All Might went on to explain their roles in this battle trial. They would separate into 2 teams, villains and heroes, and then be partnered up. All of these would be chosen at random. Izuku wilted at that. It would be left up to chance, up to luck. If it was left to chance, that could only mean one thing for Izuku. Either he would be paired against 𝗵𝘃𝗀 or partnered up with him. Both options were unpleasant, but he just knew, that he would end up with one of them. Izuku only half listened as All Might went on to explain the details, as most of his classmates had asked various questions about the exercise. All Izuku could think about was his probability of being paired up with people. One good thing about always having bad luck was that he could count on it. Therefore, he knew he wouldn't be partnered up with Ida nor with Uraraka because he knew them. That would make working with them more natural, and so, if past experience with his quirk was anything to go by, he knew he wouldn't be paired with either of them, though he might be pitted against them. He waited anxiously as All Might drew their names. All the names were drawn, and he looked to see he was paired with Todoroki. He'd been paired with Todoroki. Who was Todoroki? His gaze fell on piercing gray and blood-red, ice-encased eyes. Oh, Todoroki looked pleasant. Izuku cursed his luck, though, at this point, he knew this was going to happen. He didn't know this Todoroki person very well, but if their cold gaze was anything to go by, then being partnered with them may end up making things a little more complicated. Izuku walked up to him, hoping he would be willing to at least work with him on this. He stopped when All Might announced the first battle. It was him and Todoroki versus. He sighed as he saw who his opponent would be. He knew it was going to happen, but that didn't mean he liked it. Ida and 𝗵𝘃𝗀, his friend and his enemy, were now both his opponents. He shook his head. He had to come up with a plan. Walking up to Todoroki, he gave a friendly greeting. Todoroki, it looks like you're my partner. Without missing a beat, Todoroki responded, I don't need your help. HNN, Izuku shook his head. Of course, he was paired up with someone who didn't want to work with him. It didn't even matter that they had never spoken to each other before and had no reason to be this cold towards one another. What was that noise you just made? He sounded displeased, yet curious. Izuku quipped back, It was to voice my displeasure at your seemingly unwarranted refusal of my help, even though we've never met each other before. He stated it as a question. Not sure how to respond to that. I just can't believe you won't even try and strategize with me, is all. We're partners, and you don't have to like me, but you should at least work with me instead of brushing me off. Todoroki didn't even flinch as he responded, I don't need your help. Well then, Izuku spent the next 5 minutes they were given to prepare for the battle going through some strategies. He knew that Todoroki's quirk centered on fire and ice, but not much else. It was a fantastic quirk to have, Izuku thought bitterly. He just wished that Todoroki was more willing to help him plan countermeasures for the exercise. He knew 𝗵𝘃𝗀 would go after him. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 hated him, wanted to prove how much better he was than useless Deku. It was easy to assume that he would be the prime target for 𝗵𝘃𝗀. Time was up soon enough, and both he and Todoroki stood at the threshold of the arena. Izuku still had no idea what Todoroki planned to do as he refused to listen to anything he had to say. But he hoped that they could at least work together well enough to win. He hated 𝗵𝘃𝗀. He felt nothing but antipathy towards him, and Izuku needed, prove he could do this. He wasn't going to back down. This was his fight now, his rival, and he was going to win. He didn't even cast a glance at Todoroki as they headed towards the building. This time, Izuku wasn't going to hold back. Katsuki ceased. Where does Deku get off, having 2 quirks? He was beyond livid. Deku's only quirk was his poor luck. But now he had fucking super strength. What the fuck? This wasn't right. Deku shouldn't have 2 quirks. He wasn't that lucky, he couldn't be with his quirk. Unless that fucker was lying this whole time, saying his quirk was terrible luck when it wasn't. He shook his head of the thought. He knew Deku's quirk was misfortune. He had seen it. Once, a long time ago, he had seen Deku's quirk, the physical manifestation of it. It had been. He glared, anger, and, though he wouldn't admit it, the tiniest bit of fear flitted through his eyes. Behind him, he could hear that nerd, Ida, talking about some plan. He hated that he had been paired with that damned person. He had gotten along with Deku, which made him lame. 𝗵𝘃𝗀, did you say that Midoriya had 2 quirks? Ida asked. He didn't tell you. He scoffed, smiling wickedly. Doesn't surprise me. He knew if you knew about his actual quirk you'd never be friends with his lame ass. Ida didn't respond right away. Not that Katsuki cared. Why is that? His pure curiosity made Katsuki laugh. Because, he turned, his eyes exploding with fire. He's cursed. Everyone he's ever met has fallen victim to it. Hell, sometimes even strangers get pulled in by his fucking curse of a quirk. Before Ida could remark, they were interrupted by ice spreading out throughout the room. It looked as though the battle had started. Behind him, Ida started the engines in his legs, burning the ice and getting in a battle stance. Katsuki ignited an explosion, the sound reverberating throughout the building, the heat melting the ice quickly. He turned his attention to the door and started to stalk forward. He let a devilish grin plaster itself on his face. He was going to fucking maim that nerd. Izuku watched as Todoroki froze the entire building in awe. It wouldn't keep Bakugo nor Ida down long, he knew that. He tried to tell Todoroki that, but he ignored Izuku for the most part. He hadn't even cared that he froze Izuku's feet to the ground. Hesitantly, he called out, Todoroki, you kinda froze me here too." At that, Todoroki did stop, but the glare he sent froze Izuku more than any ice ever could. His eyes looked so cold, so lonely, so. Izuku just stared at him. What do you mean so? We're partners. You can't just leave me defenseless like this." He was a bit angry now. He didn't care how forlorn Todoroki had looked. Right now he was an ass. "You'll be fine. I can win this without your help. Besides," he turned away, "I thought you had a super-powered quirk anyway." He didn't understand this guy. What was he playing at? Izuku sighed in frustration as he tried to move his ice-clad feet to no avail. "You know," he called out, "this won't stop Bakugo for long. And you don't know where the villains hid the weapon." Todoroki ignored him. They were both shocked to hear the sound of an explosion come from below them. Todoroki started to walk forward. "I found them," he declared haughtily. He let out an exasperated sigh as he was left alone, like a sitting duck, in the hallway. This wasn't going to stop him. He wasn't going to let his perpetual lousy luck ruin his chance. He had managed to get this far with his quirk. There had to be something he could do. He went over what he knew, and the other possibilities that he could think of. One thing he was almost sure of was that Bakugo would come looking for him. His mere existence seemed to piss Bakugo off. There was a soft sound, footsteps, coming towards him. He stopped his thoughts and listened. His steps were louder now and forceful. They were coming from a little further down the hallway, possibly to his right. He waited in anticipation, feet still frozen to the floor. Someone, Bakugo, turned the corner. He got into a fighting stance, ready to defend himself when Bakugo got to him. "I need to hold him off. That's all I need to do. I may be frozen here due to Todoroki's quirk, but I refuse to give in." He mentally prepared himself for a fight. And when Bakugo's heated red eyes met his cold green ones, a storm was unleashed. Bakugo smirked as he ran forward, while Izuku let his quirk, his natural one, flow. There was one good thing about Todoroki freezing the entire floor. Ice was slippery, and if you weren't careful, you were bound to slip. Izuku smirked as he saw Bakugo lose his footing and fall on the ice. It was almost comical, and he couldn't help but let out a small laugh. It wasn't every day that Izuku got to see Bakugo look like a fool. As Bakugo struggled to get up, he sent a glare in Izuku's direction. "You fucking nerd, you think you can be a hero? Don't make me fucking laugh. You're just Deku," he spat out, gaining his footing, and using an explosion to give him a boost. The ice cracked. It moved up to Izuku, breaking the ice around his feet. He shifted his feet slightly, not enough to be noticed, but enough for him to know how much force was needed to break free overall. Bakugo had readied his right hand for a strike. Bakugo always led with his right arm. Izuku wasn't about to back down now. He was poised, ready to take the blow head-on if he had to. He was going to prove that he could do this. He waited until Bakugo's fist was about to make contact before he broke his feet free from the ice, maneuvered himself out of Bakugo's way and grabbed his arm, shifting their weight and throwing him over his shoulder. He stood proudly, not a trace of any doubt in his stance. "I may be Deku to you, Bakugo, but..." He waited until Bakugo could turn to look him in the eyes before continuing. "I'm not the same Deku as before. I'm going to be a hero, and you can't stop me. You won't stop me." "Ha!" Bakugo rose from his position on the ground steadily. "If you think I'll let a loser like you show me up, you've got another thing coming. I'm going to pound it into you. You can never be a hero." He lunged forward. Izuku dodged. Bakugo's hand hit the wall, destroying the exterior and exposing pipes, which then broke, spraying steam right into his face. With a hiss from the pipes, steam separated the two of them from each other's view. Izuku took that opportunity to get away and recollect himself. As he turned a corner, he heard Bakugo mock him. "Oi, Deku, don't think you can escape from me that easily. Just because you have a fucking cursed quirk, don't think I'm so weak as to let it stop me from destroying you." Or, a threatening taunt tinged his tone. "Are you going to take the whole building down with you?" Izuku faltered slightly but shook his head. Bakugo was just trying to get under his skin. It had worked though, and Bakugo probably knew it. That's why he had said it. But Izuku wasn't going to. He wasn't going to listen to anything Bakugo had to say anymore. He wasn't a coward. He was training to be a hero. He was still running away though. He stopped and turned, preparing to face Bakugo when he inevitably found him. Izuku could still hear him, throwing taunts to the wind. "Come on out, Deku. Show me that new power of yours. It seems to be awfully flashy." Izuku wasn't going to take the bait. He was done accepting anything Bakugo had to say to him. "How the fuck did you get another quirk, Deku? We both know it wasn't luck." Bakugo was seething now, Izuku could tell, but he wasn't going to back down. Izuku wasn't going to let Bakugo's words get to him. Not anymore. Bakugo turned the corner, and his menacing eyes landed on Izuku's determined green ones. He let out a mirthless laugh. "What? Not going to run and hide like a coward?" He stood firm. Not anymore, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. I'm not afraid of you anymore. You should be, Deku. He held his hand up, palms facing out, and held the position. You already know how my quirk works. But if those idiots in support did what I asked, then these bracers should be storing all my sweat, and the more sweat I have, the bigger explosion I can produce. He smirked wickedly. Izuku's features morphed from confidence to unease. If 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 was storing up his sweat, then that explosion could. Don't be an idiot, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. He tried to maintain a sense of calmness in his demeanor. Unfortunately, his voice trembled ever so slightly. Heh. There was a devious gleam in 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏's eyes, and for one moment, Izuku questioned his sanity. He looked demented, downright mad in this moment. You wouldn't. You'd take down the entire building. Not to mention, he silently added that an explosion of that caliber, if that hit him, he could die, or at the very least be critically injured. Through his intercom, he could hear All Might telling 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 to back down. He thought 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 would at least listen to All Might, but his devilish smile only grew more intense. As long as it's not a direct hit, it won't kill him, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 shouted, moving his hands and pulling the pin from his bracers. There was a moment where nothing happened. It was hauntingly quiet, disturbingly still. It happened so quickly, Izuku wasn't even conscious of jumping out of the line of fire. His body moved on its own, and a good thing too, because a moment later, and he would have been burnt to a crisp. The shockwave from the blast sent him straight into a wall that crumbled upon contact. It took a moment for Izuku to gather his wits about him, thoroughly shaken from the blast. When he had gained a semblance of himself, he realized with startling clarity and horror that 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 had almost killed him. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 had tried to kill him, whether it was consciously or not. And he hoped, that it had been a miscalculation and not intentional. That attack had been sent straight towards him, and if it had hit him, he would have died. Izuku tried to get up, the rubble shifting underneath from where he had landed. Out of the smoke and debris, Izuku saw a shadow emerge. His hair stood on end, and his eyes went wide. His face twisted into a horrified expression as 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 emerged from the smoke screen. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏's fingers twitched at his sides, the smoke and debris hiding most of his face, obscuring it until it was only a shadow. Still, his glaring red eyes burned like coals in the night. He tried to back away. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. He stuttered out, What are you crazy? At that moment, he looked like an absolute madman. Why don't you use that goddamn flashy quirk of yours? His hands closed into a fist, smoke rising from them. Seething hatred slithered through his words. I'm going to fucking make you use that quirk, even if I have to break you to do it. Izuku stared at him in disbelief. This was madness. He had always been terrified of 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. He had said that he wasn't going to be afraid any longer. But looking into those red eyes now, seeing them ringed with an insatiable bloodlust, Izuku couldn't help but let a thrill of fear run through him. He was downright petrified, but he was also angry. He was pissed off that 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 thought his actions were okay, justified even. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 wanted to be a hero, just like him. It angered him to see 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 treat this as some kind of game. It wasn't a game. This, right now, may be an exercise, but becoming a hero was his dream. It wasn't some goddamn game that you could win. It was a livelihood. He wanted to help people. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 just wanted to win. He couldn't stand that. Determination flared through his being as he stood up. Is this some kind of game to you, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏? 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 seemed to falter a bit, but regained himself quickly enough. So, you can still fight. Good, 'cause I'm gonna beat that quirk out of you if I have to, he sneered. Izuku was about to respond when he received a message from Todoroki. I'm in the basement. I found the villains. His voice was drab, but Izuku was grateful that he had even told him anything at all. He squared up to 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏. Okay, great, we're exactly in the basement. The response from Todoroki was curt and a bit cold. It doesn't matter. It will only take me a minute to subdue the villain and grab the weapon. Just stay out of my way. Roger that, he bit out a little cruelly. He knew Todoroki was strong. If he remembered correctly, he did get into Yue on recommendations. He didn't want to interfere with him. His job was to subdue 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏, and he had formed a plan to do so. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 came rushing towards him. He took up a stance to combat him. Right as 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 neared him, Izuku had prepared to grab his hand, but before he could, 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 let out a small explosion in front of his face. He hadn't been expecting the sudden wave of smoke and ash that filled the air, but it had been enough of a diversion for 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 to go behind him and strike him square in the back. He took a shaky step, coughing, the wind knocked out of him from the impact. It caused him to stumble forward a bit, falling. However, before he could make his acquaintances with the floor, something slammed into his side, hard. He wheezed. There was no time to recover before he was dragged through the air and thrown across the room, where he crashed on the ground with an involuntary shudder, his bones rattling from the impact. He's not going to give me any leeway. I can't beat him though. I know that he's too strong for me, but I can't give up. I'm not running away from him anymore. 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 was walking towards him, his face a shadowed smile lit by an insatiable spark of insanity. There was something feral about 𝗵𝘃𝗀𝗏 at that moment, and Izuku could see it, could feel it. It was almost tangible. Deku, he growled. When are you going to use that new quirk of yours? He didn't respond. Ignoring me. I'll show you, you fucking nerd. You're not better than me. Just because you somehow got another quirk, which is bullshit, doesn't mean you're better than me. That wasn't what he was doing. Not at all. I'm not. I don't think I'm better than you. Of course you're not. 𝗪𝗂𝐻 sneered. Remember what you did. With that fucking cursed quirk of yours. There's no way some cursed nerd like you, who did that, could ever be a hero. For a second, everything froze. Time had come to a standstill. Izuku did remember. Hell, he'd never forget. But that didn't mean he was okay with 𝗪𝗂𝐻 bringing it back up. That was crossing a line, and 𝗪𝗂𝐻 knew it. Slowly, in a trance, Izuku rose from the ground. All of his senses put themselves on mute. He couldn't find it within himself to show any emotion at that moment. Then, all too suddenly, anger and fear lashed out in his features. He felt livid, but he was utterly calm. The frozen trance he had been in washed away, and time continued to move at a reasonable pace. 𝗪𝗂𝐻 was right. What had happened that day, it had been because of him. Because of his quirk. He had ruined the lives of many people that day. But he could still do good. He could still be a hero. Right? Izuku wanted to prove 𝗪𝗂𝐻 wrong. He needed to. Because he would be a hero. He hadn't meant to. Back then, it had been an accident. Was there nothing he could do to show how much things had changed since then? He shook his head violently, dispelling the thought from his head. What's done was done. He couldn't go back in time to change it. All he could do was move forward, learn from it, better himself from it. He intended to prove everyone, even himself, wrong. 𝗪𝗂𝐻 was coming after him now, his arm ready to blast him once more. Izuku prepared himself. He wasn't going to be caught unawares this time. Clandestinely. He snuck a hand behind him and grabbed the capture tape they had been given. He had put it in one of the pouches on his belt. He wasn't stronger than 𝗪𝗂𝐻, but he was smart. He knew what 𝗪𝗂𝐻 would do, and he would use that against him. Once the tape was secured in his hand, he made it look as though he were ready to throw a punch. He even fired up one for all, focusing on controlling the overwhelming power that flowed through his veins. With two fists raised, poised and ready to strike, they closed in on each other. In a moment's notice, Izuku had started shifting his position, releasing his quirk, preparing to trap 𝗪𝗂𝐻 with the capture tape. When an announcement startled both of them. The heroes have successfully taken the weapon from the villains. The heroes win, almost instinctively. He released his quirk, but in his surprise, Izuku tripped and stumbled, his momentum causing him to effectively collide with 𝗪𝗂𝐻. Since 𝗪𝗂𝐻 had already prepared to attack Izuku, whereas Izuku was going to trap 𝗪𝗂𝐻, his open palms ended up slamming into Izuku's side and igniting. The resulting explosion was anything but kind to Izuku's shoulder and ear. The pain reverberated through his shoulder, clattering his bones and bringing him to his knees. His ear was ringing, a high-pitched, incessant noise driving through him. What the fuck? 𝗪𝗂𝐻 shouted, unconcerned with the damage he had done to Izuku. Through the pain, Izuku bit out, "You were so concerned with taking me down you forgot the actual point of this exercise." He took a deep breath as another burning wave of pain washed through him. "You forgot about Todoroki. He was able to take down Ada and procure the weapon." 𝗪𝗂𝐻 just glared at him. "Fucking nerd. I would have destroyed you." The ringing in his ear had subsided a little by now, the noise more manageable. Taking a steadying breath, he slowly rose to his feet, his arm clutching his shoulder. Izuku spoke. "Of that, I have no doubt, but that wasn't the point of this training." It was cold, deadpanned. Izuku just didn't care right now. All his anger from before was just gone. If anything, he was more frustrated with how he had let that anger bubble up and distract him from the exercise. He was disappointed in himself. 𝗪𝗂𝐻 knew just how to get under his skin, and that bothered him a lot. He should be used to 𝗪𝗂𝐻's pestering, to his incessant need to belittle everything he did. But it still got to him, it still bothered him. Deep down, he knew why that was. He wanted more than anything for 𝗪𝗂𝐻 to see him as an equal, to look at him and not just see a curse. He wanted 𝗪𝗂𝐻 to see him as a person. He didn't though. All he saw was a walking curse who thought they were more than they were. It hurt, in both senses of the word. Izuku thought resentfully as he clutched his shoulder and gasped at the fire that ran through him. Despite 𝗪𝗂𝐻's insistence that he was, Izuku refused to believe he was a curse. Slowly, he and 𝗪𝗂𝐻 left the building. 𝗪𝗂𝐻 wasn't looking at him. And for that, Izuku was grateful. He realized that maybe it wasn't worth it to try and mend things with 𝗪𝗂𝐻. Perhaps they couldn't be friends, just bitter rivals, if that. He couldn't change 𝗪𝗂𝐻's views on the matter though, and part of him was tired of trying. Toshinori sat through the first battle in anticipation. The fight between Midoriya and 𝗪𝗂𝐻 had been interesting. He may have let it get a bit out of hand, but he could sense it. Those boys needed to work through something. He didn't know precisely why 𝗪𝗂𝐻 had seemed to target Midoriya, but that was something he could ask later. He couldn't hear what they were talking about, but the looks in their eyes had been desperate. He couldn't bring himself to stop them. He regretted that decision the moment he saw them all leave the building. Midoriya was clutching his shoulder, the arm hanging limply at his side, and was adamantly refusing to look at Bakugo. Ida and Todoroki were the only two people to come out of the fray unscathed, seeing as they hadn't been targeted as Midoriya had, and Todoroki had been able to subdue Ida easily after a few minutes of a cat-and-mouse-like chase down in the basement. Midoriya looked almost ashamed of himself, but for what, Toshinori hadn't a clue. There wasn't any audio in the battleground, and therefore he was only able to go off of their actions, which had been very violent. If it wasn't obvious before, which it was, then it was clear now that Midoriya and Bakugo had some bad blood. Toshinori waited for them all to gather around before giving them his review of the scene. That was certainly an explosive first round. It was spectacular. However, I think the person who showed the most prowess in this exercise was Ida. He had thought the choice was rather obvious, but it didn't appear as visible to the students as it did to him. Midoriya still looked shamefaced, something he still wasn't entirely sure as to why. Todoroki looked deadpanned as if he didn't care one way or another, while Bakugo had a murderous aura around him. Ida just looked shocked, and possibly a little confused. It was Tsuyu who spoke up first, but I thought the winners were Midoriya and Todoroki. Before he got a chance to speak, another student, Yaoyorozu, gave an explanation. It's simple. Out of the four of them, Ida was the one who adapted to their environment and people the most. He changed his dynamic when necessary. Moreover, he acted calmly and took precautions, even if in the end he was no match for Todoroki's quirk. Toshinori was about to ask if anyone had anything to add when she continued in her explanation. After watching the battle, it's clear that both Bakugo and Midoriya were driven by something personal, though Bakugo more so than Midoriya. Todoroki, on the other hand, was detached from the entire thing. He trapped his partner in his ice at the very beginning. He acted as though this was a solo mission, not bothering to use his partner at all. As it stands, Ida was the only one who played by the true spirit of this training. She spoke professionally, as if utterly sure of herself. Toshinori was a bit surprised at how thorough she had been, but he didn't disagree, precisely. He flashed a smile before looking at Midoriya, who was still clutching his shoulder, his posture tense. It looked like it might be dislocated. Midoriya, why don't you head on over to Recovery Girl's office and see about fixing that shoulder up? Midoriya looked scandalized at the prospect. What? But then I'll miss out on seeing everyone else's battle. My arm's fine, he said frantically, trying to brush it off, but his wince ruined the effect. He shook his head. Young Midoriya, there is no reason for you to stay. You can get a recap of the class's stats after you've healed your injuries. Midoriya gave him a vaguely betrayed look, but nodded nonetheless, and left to go to the nurse's office. Toshinori figured he could meet up with the boy after class. Toshinori briefly wondered what had happened during the training exercise. Midoriya had looked shaken to his core afterward. And Bakugo, he seemed downright livid, ready to maim someone, which wasn't too far from what he had done. It didn't sit well with him. Izuku rushed out of the nurse's office as soon as he was given the okay to leave. It wasn't so much that he didn't want to be there, but he didn't want to be there. He had nothing against Recovery Girl. In fact, she had been quite pleasant. He thought it may have had to do with the fact that he hadn't come to her with a self-inflicted injury. But class was letting out soon, and he had kind of hoped to meet up with Uraraka and Ida after class. He had wanted to congratulate Ida on his excellent work during their class today. He was disappointed with his performance. He knew that it had been Bakugo who had come looking for him, trying to pick a fight, but he had still been goaded into fighting back. He had let his issues get in the way of his rational thought, and he hadn't even tried to contact Todoroki, pushing the view aside because he thought Todoroki would just ignore him. How callous could he be? That was unacceptable. He shook his head as he turned a corner, bumping into someone. Oh hey, sorry man, Midoriya. Hey, dude, you were amazing out there today. Super manly. He looked up to see a redhead giving him a toothy grin. He took a small step back, not expecting to be praised. He took a second to assess the group before him. There were 4 people he vaguely recognized from class. They all looked happy and excited to see him. It wasn't something he was used to and it caused him to fluster a bit. I really wasn't. I let my personal bias interfere. He was cut off by a girl standing behind the redhead. She had vibrant pink skin and a spunky attitude. Seriously, that was so cool how you took Bakugo down. It fired us all up. It was really amazing how you were able to think quickly, even after Todoroki froze you to the floor. That wasn't very cool of him, Karo. Another person added. She had green hair and a frog-like look to her. Izuku just stood there shocked. He hadn't expected anyone to comment on his battling abilities at all, let alone praise him for it. Oh, I'm Kirishima Ijiru, by the way, the redhead proclaimed, grinning like a fool. Oh, and I'm Ashido Mina. The girl with pink skin enthused. Another girl, shorter and with green hair, introduced herself as Tsuyu. The last one in the group didn't say anything, but waved meekly and gave a kind smile. It was all a bit overwhelming. Izuku wasn't used to this, and so he just awkwardly waved. Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku. He sheepishly scratched the back of his neck. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw 𝗵𝘃𝐻 walk past them. At that moment, he had decided one thing: he needed to talk to 𝗵𝘃𝐻. He wasn't sure what, exactly, compelled him, but he needed to talk to him. He didn't want to, but he knew he had to. They had been enemies for so long, for frivolous reasons. But that had to end. Neither of them could continue on this path to become heroes if they couldn't lay down their differences. They didn't need to be friends, but they couldn't continue on this way either. As graciously and politely as he could, he shimmied his way past his classmates and headed towards the doors where 𝗵𝘃𝐻 had left. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 had his hands in his pockets, and his posture was slumped. It was a sure sign that he was pissed. Izuku wanted nothing more than to avoid him for the rest of his life. But he couldn't do that. There was a disconnect between them. They both knew it, and Izuku wasn't sure they would be able to fix it. He needed to see if it was even worth trying. "Hey, 𝗵𝘃𝐻," he called out, running up to catch up with the blonde. As per usual, he tripped about halfway there. He could hear 𝗵𝘃𝐻 scoff at him as he stood up and brushed himself off. "What do you want, nerd?" 𝗵𝘃𝐻 bit out aggressively. Izuku gazed at him for a moment, voice not working. He knew what he wanted: for them to get over their childish rivalry. But was that even possible? 𝗵𝘃𝐻, something cold said in his eyes. "We're not friends." 𝗵𝘃𝐻 just rolled his eyes. "No shit, as if I'd ever be friends with you." "No," Izuku didn't back down. "That's not what I meant." He sighed, trying to control his breathing before starting again. "I had always wondered why you hated me so much. Some part of me knew it wasn't just my quirk. You didn't like me even before our quirks manifested. You and me, we're never going to get along. We never have, and I need to understand that." A little bit of sorrow had set into his features. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 was still glaring at him, but there was something in his eyes. Hatred or regret? Izuku couldn't tell. He continued, "𝗵𝘃𝐻, we're not friends, but we're not enemies either. I refuse to see it that way. But I don't see us as rivals either." Though his voice was solid, he slumped his posture a little, letting loose all the tension he had been holding in. "I know you hate me, I know that. And I'm going to stop being delusional about our relationship. We're barely even acquaintances. So, my point is," he let his comment linger, regaining himself and standing up a bit straighter, "I'm done playing your games. I'm not the Deku you called me anymore, and I'm not the same as I was back then. I'm not going to be afraid of you anymore." 𝗵𝘃𝐻 remained silent. His eyes were stirring with something, and he was shaking slightly. When he did speak, it was nothing more than a whisper. "Is that all? Deku, did you just come here to tell me how much better you are as a person?" Izuku stopped, shaken by his comment. "So what?" 𝗵𝘃𝐻 continued. "You got this new quirk and all of a sudden you think you're so fucking great. Is that how it is?" His voice rose steadily as he spoke. Tell me, Deku. Why do all of a sudden think you're so great? Where do you get off getting a new quirk? You're not better than me, damn it. You may have beat me today, but He was quaking now, and his eyes were rimmed red. Izuku had never seen 𝗵𝘃𝐻 look so emotional, not since that time. "I swear it, Deku. I swear that from here on out, I'm going to be number one." Izuku continued to stare at him, wide-eyed. He didn't have words. There was nothing to say. He gulped, trying to digest 𝗵𝘃𝐻's declaration. He had always considered 𝗵𝘃𝐻 to be the best concerning strength, so he was having a little difficulty realizing that 𝗵𝘃𝐻 had, in a perverse way, acknowledged his power. Maybe they couldn't be friends. That ship had sailed a long time ago, but they could. They could still try and push each other to do better. Izuku would continue to prove that he belonged here, that he had earned it, and it wasn't because of luck, while 𝗵𝘃𝐻 would take that as a challenge to do better. It was more than likely a bit dysfunctional, but if it meant that 𝗵𝘃𝐻 would finally begin to see him as a person, an equal and not a curse, he would take it.